Morning, everyone. Welcome to our workshop and briefings day on the 13th of August. It's lovely to see you all here. We do have a couple of councillors away, just acknowledging Councillor Montgomery and Councillor Kamson. Let's start our workshop with our karakia. Tākina te marama kia tātou, tākina te aroha kia tātou, tākina te rangimarie kia tātou, ko Porongia me te kawa, ko Mangatotiri, ko Kakapuku nā maunga, ko Waikato, ko Waipa nā awa. Tihe Māori ora. Wonderful. And I'll start off by welcoming Brad Ward, and we have Shane Brodie with him from Sport Waikato. Lovely to see you both. And they're here to discuss with us the Northwestern Cambridge Town Belt Master Plan. Oh, and we have Andy Adams as well from Visitor Solutions Online. Nice to see you, Andy.
Morena tātou. Firstly, like Nita did yesterday, I'd just like to acknowledge the LTP project team because I understand you've got a busy program of workshop items there today, but they kindly let us jump the queue to the front to allow for our external people here to attend, so thank you to them. I am supported here today by Shane Brodie, the Spaces and Places Manager at Sport Waikato. Shane provides strategic leadership to the Spaces and Places Planning Network, working with councils, iwi, funders, developers and our sport and recreation organisations to deliver on the priorities of the Waikato Regional Active Spaces Plan. And online we have Andy Adams. He's a consultant at Visitor Solutions, specialising in facility planning, space optimisation and project development and event management. So yeah, we're kind of the project team, and also acknowledge Sport Waikato in terms of their partnership to actually achieve this piece of work, and they're sort of helping fund and drive this as well. Perfect, I'm working today. Today we'll share with you some key themes and findings from our initial engagement with clubs, users and sporting bodies who use the Cambridge Town Belt and the wider sporting network. And we're seeking feedback on the emerging vision, objectives and strategic direction before preparing the draft master plan. So yeah, today we'll refresh you on the need for the project, what we're trying to achieve and what we've heard through our initial engagement through May and June. And we'll share the vision and objectives with you and test if you think or consider they are appropriate for the master plan development. We'll then identify what the next steps are and take any final partai you may have at the end. Moving through to the need. The Northwestern Town Belt is one of Cambridge's most important recreation and sporting spaces. The area is experiencing significant growth and pressure, and also changing community needs and requests with new sporting infrastructure. We also have significant transport and land use challenges in and around the town belt, and need to consider these collectively rather than a site-by-site piecemeal way forward. This master plan provides an opportunity to establish a coordinated long-term vision for the area, and without a master plan there's risk of ad hoc development that limits future opportunities and doesn't maximise the community benefit. A lot of these projects sort of stem from the 2021 LTP, and where we heard many submissions from all the isolated groups trying to do things in isolation. So now we're trying to connect all that up and see what's needed for the future. Acknowledging the wider sporting and recreation spaces as well, this master plan focuses specifically on the Northwestern Town Belt, so sort of from Hamilton Road near the athletics club or at the athletics clubs, all the way around, sort of including the racecourse and the areas leased behind that, through across Victoria Road, all the way to Swain Road. That's the area we're focusing on. But we do acknowledge that there is wider sporting and recreation opportunities throughout Cambridge and also the greater Te Awamutu and Waipa areas. So yeah, that's the area that we're sort of focusing through.
Morena, thanks for having me. So this area also interfaces with Cambridge High School, Cambridge Raceway and future growth areas, along with considerations of wider sporting network, including St Peter's of Cambridge. decisions are made within this area can have significant implications for sport and recreation provision across Cambridge and the wider sub-region. One of the key reasons for progressing the master plan is the increasing and often competing requests for facilities from clubs and community organisations. As Cambridge continues to grow, there is an increasing demand for organised sport and recreation, along with the need to cater for changing demands and the future participation trends, highlighting the need to plan for spaces that can adapt over time. Updated analysis that was completed also by Sport Waikato identified that existing shortfalls are currently experienced across Waipa, particularly in Cambridge, with a deficit of 60 hours of sport field space by 2038. So that's about 7 to 8 soil fields, meaning that optimisation, reconfiguring becomes as important as development, and this is part of the master plan. Critically, we have funders seeking clarity and clearer direction around priorities before making investment decisions, noting that there's less external funds around. So what are we trying to achieve? We want to use existing data provided by Waipa and the region and national directions and ground truth data from our clubs and organisations that with our users and sport providers through their individual discussions. Through these discussions, we want to see alignment that can be achieved through connected and collaborative approach to sporting infrastructure. Providing a master plan for this site will provide clear adopted directions for council, sporting organisations and users, and encourage funders and philanthropic funders to fund the needs of community through a consolidated picture, giving them confidence. Critically, we want to avoid what Brad said, ad hoc development or duplicated development, with many of the assets expensive to install, maintain, and a planned cohesive approach is as important to ensure that this strategically located piece of land is maximised effectively now and into the future. Andy?
Thanks, Shane. Kia ora koutou, everyone. So in terms of the stakeholder engagement that commenced earlier this year, where we had an initial project briefing, which was undertaken with existing users and stakeholders. So for that particular meeting, we had more than 30 attendees in place, which is really encouraging to help inform the project. This was followed then by a range of individual meetings with clubs, schools, facility operators and partner organisations. So with the current users, we met with 11 different groups, and then that extended out into regional sports organisations, mana whenua, and other interested parties. This information was also supplemented by a range of secondary data that was available, so we felt it was really important that we built from what we already have rather than starting everything from scratch. So feedback gathered during this phase was then helped to inform the emerging vision, objectives and spatial options for the master plan. Just moving to the next slide, please. So in terms of what we've heard during this engagement, several consistent themes have emerged. Stakeholders want greater certainty, direction around future investment in land use. And as you'll appreciate, there's strong interest in improving the sporting infrastructure to meet current and future needs. There's also recognition that decisions need to consider the broader town belt network to respond to their needs rather than the individual sites in isolation, as been mentioned previously. So while there are the access and use and pressure constraints, along with ageing facilities, duplication of assets across the town belt, there are opportunities that exist through the large land parcels, and there's openness to explore options that focus on shared facilities and multi-use, along with options across the wider network. Through to you, Brad.
Back to me, yeah. So, so this is the slide that we kind of want to get your interest and feedback on. Apologies for the small text there again. But so, yeah, these visions and objectives have been developed from the background work that we've spoken about just now. The objectives of the current reserve management plan for the town belt, and also the stakeholder engagement. The vision and open space town belt that provides for the physical welfare and diverse recreational needs of a growing community, while maintaining and enhancing the park-like qualities for which it is valued, seeks to balance organised sport, informal recreation, community wellbeing and future growth. So we're really interested to hear whether you feel that vision reflects Council's aspirations for this strategically important piece of whenua. And the objectives are intended to guide that future infrastructure investment, the land use and the partnership opportunities. So you're also seeking feedback on those objectives and if they're appropriate and if we've missed anything in particular or any red flags. And so any feedback that we receive from you today, we can incorporate before the plan is, the master plan is starting to be developed. What was I going to say on there? I was going to say something else there. Anyway, I'll pass back to you there, Andy. Next steps.
Thanks, Brad. So from here, feedback that we received from today's workshop will then go through and help inform the spatial options that we're going to be looking at for the draft master plan. We'll then be going back to the user groups and stakeholders by the end of this month to share with them what we've heard, to discuss some of the spatial options for inclusion into a preferred master plan.
Yeah, and as part of that, we're also going to the Cambridge Community Board next week to share the same presentation and get their feedback through this process as well. And then once we've done all that work, we'll draft a master plan and we'll then bring that back to this table in a formal committee for your approval to then go and just seek the wider community's feedback through a consultation process. And we're currently drafting a comms plan with our team specifically around that now. So yeah, that's kind of a very quick snapshot of what the project is and where we're at to now. Yeah, as I said, we're particularly interested in your views on 3 areas around that draft vision. Does that reflect Council's position well? And have we identified the right strategic priorities and objectives? And are there any other opportunities, risks or community considerations that we should be incorporating before we go to the next step?
Thanks, Brad. I just had a question. Where you had your individual meetings and site visits, did you guys connect with the Lions Club with their Lions Shed location by the brass band area?
I'll give that one to you, Andy.
Thanks, Andy.
Yeah, so no problem at all. Thank you for the question. We did reach out multiple times to the Lions Group. We actually haven't had a response back to any of the opportunities to speak with us.
Okay, all right. No, that's good feedback. Okay. Roger, I had a question from you.
Yeah, I support the concept of going ahead with this. Joe and I had a meeting just a couple of days ago. And I'm really, really pleased to see the coordination of functional support facilities being mentioned, because there is a lot of use of that particular land now by both formal and informal groups, which is good to see. Yeah. But the report that we had is that a number of people were using a natural toilet in that area because there were no other facilities available, which we were rather disappointed with. But it does show that there is a need. And because there are so many different groups, when sometimes the facilities that are there are not open, that they've left with no choice but to use the natural toilet. The other thing is that part of that, and I'm talking particularly about the corner, the Hautapu corner, where we've got that informal, I think it's informal, I don't think it's been designated as a mobile trader park, but it's part of the area that you're talking about. And maybe that's got to be considered. Does that need to be formalized and designated? Or is it not the intention to have mobile traders there, which I think there is a need, because we've got about 3 or 4 that actually use that area. Can I ask a question within this? Would, again, the consideration of centralised management of sporting places be incorporated within this plan? Because we had a heated debate over that last year, year before.
That's right. So this doesn't go into that model review. This is, I mean, I think what you raised earlier on the toilets highlights that need that
Oh,
at the
yeah.
moment that those areas are leased and those facilities are provided by clubs at the moment. So we don't have any of our own assets, you know, or toilets specifically through that piece of network. But yeah, this doesn't include looking at what our model of sports management looks at. This just looks like coming together with all the clubs that we know of, all the competing and or collaborative interests for the area, and trying to make sure that any investment into the space is done in a really strategic way. You'll appreciate that some of the sport infrastructure, car parks, any artificial turf, you know, these things, once they're in for a long time. So we'll make sure we get these absolutely right.
I suppose.
Roger, I'm so sorry. I have a very long list of speakers, so I will need to move on. Pip, I'll go to you, then Shane, Marcus, Dean, and Mike.
Brad, you and I had the discussion with regard to the soccer club, which has a lease arrangement, and therefore there's a bit of a conflict with cricket. And it surprised me that the soccer club actually had a formal lease and therefore felt they had a degree of control. If we're to head towards this plan, which I very much support, if you end up with a hodgepodge worth of sort of lease arrangements to different clubs and organisations, the council will not be able to control and coordinate these activities. So what is the plan in association with this to make sure that we as an entity can control things as opposed to giving rights away to to individual clubs who feel as though they control it rather than we as a wider entity does? And that implies to both obviously Cambridge and anywhere in the network.
Yeah, thanks, Pip. Good question. In recent discussions, I know that Cambridge Football have reached out to Cambridge Cricket to sort of relocate or remove some of those pitches. I need to go back to both those clubs and just wrap back to them. But essentially, we wouldn't support any removal until this piece of work is finished. We believe that this will hopefully provide some clarity across that network. But specifically for club leases at the moment, yes, they do have an element of control and maintenance requirements through that, but part of the lease agreement is outside of the times that they're using it, it must be available for public use or other use. So we do have some parameters in there that we can have that discussion with them on, and any lease renewals we can try and work in any further clauses around that.
But is it appropriate that we actually have a lease, or is it sort of some form of non-formal lease arrangement to make sure that we do actually control the asset?
Well, that's part of the broader project, which is not aligned, not in part of this scope of work for this project. And that we have, as Roger mentioned, we have had some quite significant debate on that in the last probably 18 months to 2 years. But at this point in time, we're in the position we're in with those current lease models.
Thanks, Pip. Shane.
Yeah, Brad, this is good stuff. I like master planning, but my concern is, and this is good work, getting all those clubs together and looking at the future. But this is a master plan of a small part of Waipa. So my question is there a master plan for the whole of the Waipa? That's number one question. And then I'd like to understand, what is the role of council and what is the role of Sports Waikato regarding this?
Yeah, very good question. Thanks, Councillor Shane. So the reason we're focused on the specific piece of whenua in Waipa is the strategic provision of it. Is that what I'm looking for? Location of it, probably better. So there's already a lot of activity that's happening on those sites, big clubs, and they're bursting with numbers. And not only is it serving Cambridge, but it's also servicing the greater Waipa, but also people from Manamata Piako, from South Waikato that are coming through. So instead of having to go all the way to Hamilton, they can actually utilise some of our areas. Maybe I'll throw that one to you, Shane, if I've missed anything there.
Yeah, so we acknowledge that council had put a master plan for the Cambridge Northern Town Bout in the last long-term plan, maybe years 28, 29. We had a lot of requests from funders and sporting organisations to advance development, in particular hockey turf, artificial turf, removal of cricket grounds, new cricket wickets, cricket nets, a lot that's concentrated in this area that we're talking about. As part of the work, we have gone wider. We've looked at the wider Waipa and Cambridge community. We've met with Leamington, we've looked at Leamington Domain, we've looked at future growth cells and planning it, and worked closely with Cambridge High School and St Peter's as well around opportunities. So we have considered a network before coming in. We do need to come in though, because there are multiple sporting groups proposing large asset developments that could have long-term implications or long-term positive outcomes if planned well. So that's why, as Sport Waikato, we're partnering with Waipa to advance this earlier.
Yeah, and if I can just double back, I want to be clear, this doesn't stop development or investment in other areas of Waipa and Sports Network. We're having ongoing conversations with Te Ameru Football and other codes around the district. But just due to the competing nature or the high intensity of this site, we just wanted to make sure we get things right.
Yeah, and hence my question, because I don't want to have an ad hoc, you try not to be ad hoc in that area, but it's been ad hoc Waipa wide is my concern. And I'm pleased to know that Sport Waikato working with Te Ameru Squash Club as well to look at their future. So it's good to understand the big picture, but thank you.
Thanks, Shane. Marcus.
I'm just wondering with the feedback times, is there going to be a little bit of feedback fatigue with going up to people everywhere? Because it seems we've got everything happening at the end of this year, September, October, November, for different varieties of feedback. But so have you checked that out, that it's all good?
That's part of the work that we're going to be doing as part of the communications plan that we're doing for that piece of work. So it will ensure that timing hopefully lands coordinated.
It's a good question, Marcus. Dean.
Thanks, Madam Chair. My first point, I agree with Shane. The idea of having a approach like this where we're coordinated is great. It feels a bit uncoordinated on the Te Ameru side, and I've made numerous submissions over the years about trying to bring some of our codes together to help them. What I thought would help them, none of them happened, and I think we've missed some opportunities. So I'd like to see similar work here. My actual question is around the raceway under the Waikato racing model. What becomes of Waikato the Cambridge Raceway?
As part of this process, we have engaged with Cambridge Raceway and their board. Obviously, they're in big discussions at the moment. Project Stamina, from a national perspective, has just released a report around harness and thoroughbred racing. We've got the Greenfields plan, of which through Fast Track is considering harness as well. So all of that's going on at the moment. So there are live discussions. The conversation we're having with Cambridge Raceway is the next couple of months are pretty critical for them in the planning. We're trying to understand what that looks like in their timeframes, but we are taking into consideration if, say, the future of harness is not there, what parts of that currently the town bout are out of the reserves, and how much assets could you actually put in there for community outcomes. So that's a wider consideration, but there's live discussions at the moment, a lot going on in Raceway.
Does the racing club own the raceway?
Yeah, they do. So essentially the main buildings are there and the whole track that's in private ownership. And then the town belt sort of comes across the road from Victoria Road near Hautapu, and all that is reserve land, those paddocks, and then it sort of kicks around the outside of the racetrack as well.
Thanks, Dean. Mike, and then back to Roger. That will probably be our full question time.
Right, thank you through the chair. First thing is, I'd just like to acknowledge the inputs and I guess the initiative that Sport Waikato have taken to do this, because without you folks, this would not have been done. There was no money in our budget this year to do that. So just really like to acknowledge yourself and take that back to Matt and the wider team also. Just a couple of clarifications. I heard you, and you mentioned it, I think twice now, St. Peter's as part of in the mix here, and is that more around artificial turf decisions, or is beyond that?
Yeah, so we've engaged with both high schools and they obviously want to consider what partnership looks like in terms of facility outcomes. So I guess nothing's off the table without going into too much detail here today, because it would be a directive of St. Peter's. But, you know, they've got a focus at the moment that focuses on they're looking at cricket, golf and athletics. So when they mention athletics, it's, you know, things, there are opportunities there as well that need to be explored and they're willing to explore.
Thanks for that. Next one is, Brad, did I hear you say that this sort of stops at Swains Road? It doesn't go down the, like all the way down to say Blakey's Reserve, McLaren Street, all the way down Taylor, all those paddocks and oak arboretums, and doesn't include all that vacant land?
That's correct. Just our window for now is just through to Swain Road, which is where most of the activity of formal and recreational sport happens at the moment.
What's the rationale of not extending it into what effectively is leased land that's used for not even grazing, just silage and haylage? It's just some good ground there that, I mean, I'm just looking at some of these things and you're talking about joining them up, but there's a whole lot of vacant land there that, to me, why wouldn't we have this in there?
I think, I mean, we could, but then this becomes.
Well, hang on, I'll rephrase it. Can we have it? I mean, can we extend it to have it in there?
We can take that away and have consideration of that. Yeah.
All right.
Probably just a comment I would make is that not all the town belt is solely for sport and recreation as well. There's also biodiversity benefits in the future, and also ensuring that we've got wider or future use development instead of just taking it all up now. Obviously, Cambridge is going to be here for a long time, and we need to make sure we keep our options open long term.
Right.
Yeah. All right. And my last question though is you've got a meeting coming up, I think in September it was, with all the groups, getting them back together, for August it was or something. In terms of you're looking at trying to be efficient with them, and I'm thinking about efficiency of use of spaces, but use of potential club rooms, and a bit like the TA model here, TA sport model, which is a good model, which TA are ahead of Cambridge, so don't panic. If you encourage those folks to get together, to go, hey, lacrosse or hockey or whoever it is, I'm looking at some of these sports down here and going, are you guys talking between when you've met them last time and your next meeting?
Andy, do you want to take this just to highlight what we'll be doing at the 31st of August? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Shane. So what we're going to be doing at the next workshop is effectively use it as an opportunity workshop. So we're going to present a couple of different spatial options. And within that, we're going to be splitting the everyone up into groups and discussing what works well, what doesn't. And some of the discussion that should stem from that is how do we potentially collaborate in that together? What we heard individually was, yes, there was openness to looking at multi-sport options and doing more together, but this is going to be the opportunity in a more formal sense to start having those discussions, seeing where there could be some symbiotic relationships between some of the groups and some of the spaces that we've got, both from an open space perspective and from a built infrastructure. And so some of that will lean into how can we potentially put this together and meet the objectives of a range of groups as opposed to being in isolation.
I think if I can just expand on that, after the first two together, you know, we sort of socialised this and introduced the project to them, and our meeting concluded, but the meeting, like everyone stayed around and talked to each other for quite some time after the meeting. And so those conversations started to foster then, and hopefully they're continuing as we go through this project.
Thanks, Brad. Roger, we've got 1 more minute left for this item, so I'll just...
First of all, just it would have been handy to have or can we have a map of with the individual ownership and lease affiliate, etc., so we can get an overall picture of the challenges.
Good point.
And the question that I have is, if I go back about 6 years there were discussions with the regional council in the provision of public transport to have a park and ride located somewhere on this particular land.
I'm wondering if that's
Am I
probably
saying that
out of
that's
scope
no
for this
longer a consideration?
item. That's probably out of scope for this item, when we're looking at sport and recreation, but that is a good question. Yeah, could be a
Yeah,
good one for Brian.
so yeah, correct, it's not fully in the scope for this, but we are working with Cambridge Connections through this project as well. So Andy's been in touch with Rachel and Katie and things, so.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you both, and Andy online. Thanks, Shane. Thanks, Brad. That was really informative. And if elected members have any more thoughts about this, obviously we're able to email you and just send those thoughts through, eh?
And apologies for the map, that's oversight on my behalf, so I'll get that out on the Friday, on the radar.
All good. Thanks, Brad.
Thank you very much.
Right. Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Shane. Right. Katie is unfortunately unwell today, so we have George presenting our next item, which is our LTP recap. So. Yeah, we can just, oh, here they are. Wonderful. Perfect timing. Yeah. Yeah. Right, we're just getting ourselves organised here in the chamber. Hi. Morning, George.
It's got, oh, here we go.
Morning, Neil. Morning, George. Nice to see you and the wider LTP team too. And Tony as well here. Thank you. Happy for you to kick us off, George.
Kia ora. Thanks, Joe. So just as Joe has said, Katie is unwell today, so I'm stepping in for her. So just want to acknowledge yesterday, which was another significant LTP day, and thank you for everybody and your input into the LTP team. We're up to our second day today, which with some quite substantive material and discussion. So I just wanted to just touch on what the intent is for today. So today we're starting to look at the financial policies, and I know that Bridget has circulated to you the roadmap, which we'll have a look at, and I think that's really useful for you to understand whereabouts we are in the process, and you'll see that we are here red box, and just sort of starts to create that picture of how everything is slowly going to come together over time. So these financial policies are another component of the LTP. So we're going to be covering off 3 policies today at various levels. One is an introduction, another going into it in a little bit more detail. We're also going to be covering off funds and grants, and we're going to be seeking direction from elected members in terms of the depth of that review and how far elected members would like us to go. At the end of the day, we'll do a wrap up in terms of sort of what we heard. And then we'll talk about in more detail what's going to happen, particularly over September, where there's some quite meaty workshops for you. So that's really the layout of the day. Where we are, I've just touched on this, so you've now got a copy in front of you. Carry that around, keep it, put it under your pillow, but very useful. And then again, I just wanted to reiterate, I think it's what's really important at the start of every of these workshops, just to reflect back on the LTP foundations. And I believe that Bridget has also handed around that as well for your ongoing reference. And that really goes through the guidance that you've provided so far in terms of the goals and priorities, the growth principles, and those financial parameters that you've provided guidance on. And it's really important that we keep all of these in mind as we go through the next stages of the process of the LTP. So that's the guidance so far in one place, which we think is really useful as well for you to keep referring to. All right, so if I start to lead in, oh, sorry, are there any questions about any of that material, roadmap or guidance before we just move on to the substantive part of the workshop?
No, but I do just want to acknowledge Steph, who's online with us this morning. Hi, Steph. She'll be listening in and adding to this conversation where she needs to. Thanks, George.
Thank you. All right, so the topic of today is LTP policies. And there's 4 policies to be considered as part of the LTP, and they're up there. And they have an impact on how council manages its funding, rates, borrowing, affordability, and equity between ratepayers. Now, some of these policies sort of have more impact than others. And so we're going to be sort of taking a little bit of a different approach for each of these policies. So the Treasury Management Policy and the Remission and Postponement of Rates Policy, we are proposing a light touch, and both Neil and Matt will talk to those 2 policies over the next couple of sessions of the workshop. And then for the other 2, the Development Contributions Policy and the Revenue and Financing Policy, they can have quite an impact on the affordability lens that we're putting through our LTP, and significant levers for elected members to be able to use. And we talked about some of those levers yesterday as well. So the Development Contributions Policy, therefore, will be more of an introduction and a discussion, and you have more opportunity to discuss that throughout the LTP development. And again, with the Revenue and Financing Policy too, seeking some guidance, but there'll be further discussions around that. So that's probably where I'm going to leave it for today, for the introduction, and just allow us to start to get into the substantive part. And I'm going to hand over to Neil, who is going to take us through the Remission and Postponement of Rates Policy. Right, yeah.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So yeah, we're just going to run you through the your rates remissions policies that are there. Let me just, can I read that from there? I probably can. Yeah, so every council has to have remissions and postponement policies in place. The main change for this round, or this round of LTP, obviously with waters going, is that we strip out anything that relates to the waters, right? And so that's, you'll see that as we go through the policy. For the remaining kind of elements, the key things that are in your policy is this into 4 parts, which is your rates, standard rates remissions policy, postponement of rates, and I'll delve into that a little bit when we get to that. Your penalty remissions and your Māori freehold land remissions. So what else have we set up there? Yeah, affordability will be considered in the context of the revenue and financing policy. So I guess fundamentally you've got, I mean, I'm sure everyone's aware of this, but rates is a tax. So the principal foundation of rates is they are a tax. Everybody has to pay. There's no free lunch. But then you have things like your emissions, which are tailored for specific circumstances. So it's just, I think, important to remember that fundamental principle that rates as a tax, everybody has to pay, unless you have a remissions policy. So I think most people understand that. Sometimes in the community, people think they don't have to pay, but there's very significant powers under the Rating Powers Act to collect, as I'm sure you're all aware. And yeah, there's no remission applied to targeted rates for waste collection, and including recycling. So that's, you know, kind of more of a service provision type stuff. So even if you've got a sports club, for example, where they get a remission on their general rates, they still have to pay the targeted rate for waste collection and recycling. So it's just in high level summary there in terms of that slide. Okay, so we'll leave that slide up there. So has everyone got the actual policy in front of them? Was that kind of handed out or on your? Yeah, cool. Yeah, thank you. Right, so I'm just going to step through the. Oh, sorry, actually, I should ask. My intention was to step through the policy and then take any questions either as we go through each part because it's in 4 parts. Just whatever kind of works for you, really.
Yeah. You say it's been a light touch. So I'm assuming that there are a minimal number of changes to this document compared to it probably would have been handy if we'd had a track change.
Yeah, good point, actually.
Model, because then we could focus on the changes.
I mean,
is there a chance to get that even retrospectively?
There was one for the Treasury one.
Yes.
The reason we didn't send the track change version, instead we did. So you'll notice with the other policy you'll notice with the Treasury policy, we did track changes. We made a decision here for efficiency actually, because the majority of these were kind of editing while we removed the waste and wastewater charges bits. So it was very messy to present that, and instead we just put a table at the completion in the memo that said what the substantive changes were.
And for context here, basically there were a couple of, we just stripped out the water and the wastewater, as we said, but we can certainly circulate around afterwards that so that you can actually see and you'll just have to trust me in the interim.
That would be great. Thanks, Neil. And if you are happy for questions throughout your presentation, I think that's probably the best way to do it. Shane, did you have one?
Yeah. Interested what's legislative so that we can't change it and what we can change, because there's no point discussing things that we can't change. So I wonder if we can narrow down to those bits. And the other thing I'd like to understand in terms of financial, how much money have we not got from rates because of this, the use of hardship, et cetera, just to understand financially.
Yeah, great question, actually. So I guess to start with, I guess what I'd say is this is what I would call a de minimis policy. So there are so we've got the minimum amount in here as per legislation, right? So the other councils do have, and you have the ability, should you choose to have a whole range of different things. So for an example I can give you there is a natural disaster type or earthquake related remission policy or something like that. So you can actually broaden your base out quite wide if you choose to. This council currently has what I would call a very narrow policy, which is just targeted specifically to what you have to do under legislation. To answer the question about the hardship one, there is a postponement policy in here around that. Currently, I was being advised this morning when I asked, is that we haven't had really any uptake on that because there's some very strict criteria around that. One of the other things to remember too is it's separate from the remissions policy, but it's the rates rebate scheme that is in place. So that's currently fully funded by government, and for next year is, where's my notes? For this current year that we're in, it's up to $830. So, in the case of hardship where people are struggling with rates, the team work with the ratepayer, make sure that they're signed up for the scheme and can get that rebate there for this year, $830. Going forward, I don't know whether this has been floated in the chamber yet or not, but there is some discussions around setting up what's called the RAS scheme, which is the Rates Assistance Scheme. So, okay, so it has been floated in the chamber. Yeah, so I think that's a vehicle that I think will get traction further down the track and will be a very good tool in the toolbox to aid with that affordability.
Sorry, I've just got Les and then straight to you.
Yeah, I would like to know, or for you to find out, the amount of QE2 or coveted land under SNA and what amount of that land is currently rebates are claimed upon. And if our liability for our rates. And the other thing is, at the moment, the SNA is under review. And it has been mentioned that councils could be required to actually buy SNAs that they want to keep.
I'd have to defer that to see if I can pass that ball to, if there's anyone else in the room that knows that. I can answer the QE2 stuff. I can't answer the SNA. Is there anyone that's familiar with the SNA side of it? Otherwise, we can just get back to you.
Yeah,
We'll get back
just,
to you
yeah,
on that.
absolutely.
I will answer the QE2 because I know that off the top of my head. So the QE2 is not a remission. So under the Act, under Schedule 1, you cannot charge rates for QE2 land, full stop. So there's no remission there. It's just you're not actually legally allowed to charge for that.
Yeah, as I understand it, on the SNAs, you've got local, regional and national. And if they're covenanted, they all can be claimed.
So handy little thing I have here is the Local Government Rating Act. So Schedule 1, Part 1, land fully non-rateable. So I'll just give you some examples here from that, because it's actually quite a pertinent question. Because previously I said that all land is rateable unless it's not, and this is part of the is not. So Part 1, Clause 1, land forming a national park under the National Parks Act, a reserve under the Reserves Act 1977, a conservation area under the Conservation Act. Not sure whether SNAs fall on that. Sorry, I actually don't know the answer to that part specifically. A wildlife management reserve, wildlife refuge or wildlife sanctuary under the Wildlife Act. Yeah, and then you get into, gosh, I'm going to need my glasses. Yeah, then you get into things like land that's used by a local authority for a public garden or reserve, children's playgrounds, etc. So there's a whole list in there, which, I mean, I'm happy to circulate that round if that's useful, or send people, councillors the link to that section of the Rating Act, if that's of interest.
Yeah.
And otherwise, you'll just sit here listening to me read the Act, which I think would be pretty boring.
I'm just saying we could be looking at a lot more claims for rateable SNAs for rebates and the way things are for farming land. So it could make a big effect on our rate stake.
Yeah, thank you for that. I will actually take a note of that because I'm not, can the team do that as well, please? I'll have to look into that one. I don't have the answer off the top of my head on that one.
Steph, did you want to jump in and just make a comment on this?
Thanks, Joe, and morning everybody. I'm standing up today. I'm doing Iron's thing. Councillor Les, are you referring to the new planning frameworks that are about to come through where council does have to provide compensation to landowners if we choose to take something as an outstanding natural landscape or a significant natural area? Is that what you're referring to?
Well, as I understand it, any area that's covenanted by councils is claimable for a rates rebate.
Yeah, so I'm not sure, to be honest, I haven't had a chance to study the operational side of that yet, but it's certainly a big change and one we probably need to spend some time on as a council to understand what the implications are for that, because there is potentially a huge cost for council for trying to protect environmental value. So Neil, I support you to get your team and with Matt to have a look at that, and we probably should bring, once the legislation is
Yeah, well, as I understand it, there's a few years ago, there was over 3,500 hectares of covenanted private land. And if that doesn't change under the Resource Management Act or that's changing, we could be having a big loss of rates.
My understanding is that I don't think it's retrospective, Les. It's only for new pieces of land that get covenanted, etc. And then we have to provide some compensation for that. I'm not sure whether James had got to a point where he'd done some modelling on it, but we certainly need to do that because it will be a cost to council. So what you're raising is a good point, and I think we do need to do some work and come back to you once we've also got some definition through the Act as well. So Neil, good work. Thanks for this, and we'll follow that point up. Thanks, Joe.
Steph. Yeah, good question, Les. Claire.
Yes, thanks, Neil. I'd like to talk about the RAS, or the Ratepayer Assistance Scheme. So, yeah, you mentioned it's not actually something that's live at the moment, but that it looks like it will come into play, hopefully after the next election. And so this is a great scheme to help people finance like solar panels, heat pumps and things like that, things that are going to save them money on heating their homes and that. They can finance the whole lot, which I think is financed through the council, and then they repay the loan through their rates over time based on the savings they've achieved with their electricity bills. Yeah. And so I was wondering, like, should we be planning to have this, or can we just wait till next year when it's hopefully available? Is the cycle of review of our policies rapid enough so that we won't have a long delay before we can offer it to our ratepayers?
Yeah. I think a couple of points there is that, yeah, 100% agree with what you're saying there in terms of the solar and stuff like that. One of the other things, and kind of why I brought it up in the context of this, is that, you know, the market currently provides, I mean, you'll be familiar with the likes of Heartland Bank, et cetera, that does reverse mortgages. Part of the RAS will include kind of an equity scheme there as well, where homeowners that are in a position where they're struggling to pay their rates can effectively do a reverse type mortgage structure through there, but at far more attractive rates than what the market is currently offering. So it's a multi-pronged approach in terms of that RAS scheme. In terms of a policy for council, I probably need to apply some more thinking to this, but my thinking at the moment is that we wouldn't actually need to do anything in a policy sense, because this is effectively a transaction that happens outside the funding. It will actually be through the LGFA, is how they're currently looking at structuring that, or a subset of that. I think it's direct through LGFA, isn't it? Anyway, that's kind of where the thinking is on the structure. So yeah, I think it's an outside of council type process. Yeah. Yeah, Matt will jump in on this one.
So can I just add to that?
Please.
Just a couple of important points on this. I'm fairly familiar with what's been a number of years of activity around the place to see if we can get to this point. First point is government need to do some stuff. And so they've been asked to do some stuff now for the best part of the last 2 years. And they appear to have now indicated that they're up for doing some stuff after the election. So they've got that far. Now, the reason they need to do some stuff is the structure needs a little bit of legislative change, a bit like when LGFA was first established. So there's a little bit of legislation that is required to then enable what would effectively be a national scheme. And the idea is to make it really, really simple for people so we don't lose ourselves in a sea of complexity, make it really simple. There's a bit of a proof case somewhere up in Canada where one of the regions there got it to a simple level at a large scale, and surprise, surprise, people start using it. But it is a little bit of, and I think there's a number of mayors who have got together. I think Nick Smith down in, where's he, Tasman, Nelson, somewhere. Yeah, he's led the charge with a few others. I think Mahi's kind of jumped into it. So there's a bit of a group who have pushed ministers hard, and they've sort of said, yeah, we're listening. Give us a break until after the election.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Matt. That was good. Shane.
Our ability to make decisions on this policy is very limited because of the legislative requirements, etc. Although you did make the comment that our policy is a bit more narrow than some councils. Now, is there any policy that is not in here that staff would recommend that we should consider? Because at this stage, it's hard for us to decide, you know, what to do unless we have some recommendation. Your recommendation may be this is a great policy, don't change anything, let's move on.
I must admit I'm a fan of simple, and this is a simple policy. So yeah, that would be my recommendation.
Good question, Shane. Claire, did you have another one?
Yeah, well, just on that point, you mentioned, Neil, that some other councils have a policy to respond to natural disasters. Yeah, and so we have experienced that. Now, we don't have, the election members haven't been advised whether or not it's affected our rates collection. I don't think it has, from the stats we get from the Finance and Corporate. But do you think it might be something that we could consider?
Oh, well, you certainly can consider any policy for sure. So, yeah, like I say, it's, there's a range of things you could do. This is a very simple policy. It seems to have been effective from my discussions with the team over the years. I guess if you were getting pressure from the community about things, you would kind of hear that now. If you're not getting that level of pressure, that kind of tells me that you're probably okay in terms of your settings. Yeah.
Then when would be the opportunity next that we'd have to consider changing this policy or expanding it? Is it 3 years?
I'm not actually sure off the top of my head as to whether you can do this one on an annual basis. I would have to get back to you on that one. Sorry, I should know, but I can't remember.
I mean, I have not heard anyone asking me about Waipa needing to have, you know, a natural disaster rates rebate policy or anything. So I accept what you say about this. Doesn't seem to be pressure from the community, but it'd be good to know, you know, how quickly we could put it in place if it was asked for. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Claire. Any further questions for Neil or Matt? No? Okay. Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Well, if I was going to step through the policy, are you still wanting to do that, or are you kind of happy that you've?
Just get a bit of guidance from the table. I mean, it is very straightforward. I'll leave that up to my fellow. I think we're probably happy. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much.
Easy.
Excellent. Right. Well, in that case, I think.
Want to make some time up?
Yeah, I think let's have our break for morning tea now, and then let's come back and start at 10:30. Should we do that? Or 10:25. 10:25. To draft. Thanks. Welcome back, everyone, after our morning tea break to our LTP workshop and briefings day. We'll go back to Neil and Matt on the draft Treasury management policy. I'll hand over to you both.
Thanks, Jo. Look, I might just give a little bit of context at the start. Might be a little lot like that horse riding analogy from yesterday as well. This has had a degree of review, but I'd like you to treat it as just a degree of review and perhaps not fully reviewed as yet. As I did my bit, having a look and catching some of the review elements, just a few things popped up in my mind, and I might just start there and then talk to the policy. We had quite a lot of discussion yesterday. We realised, LGFA covenants and so on are important. This is not a criticism, but it's taken me a while to realise that, oh, hang on, we've actually got two policies that we're working with. I'm used to those two being integrated. So we can have some internal debt management policies. It's not at all clear to me as to why we wouldn't just line those up nicely with our external ones, because then life, I think, can be easier. So that won't be too hard, and no one needs to be alarmed. There's no dramatic conflicts between the two, but I do think it'll make our life easier in this journey just to pop up when we adopt the LTP and going into that with a clear sense that there's just one set of guardrails in this space of looking after our debt portfolio and the various measures we have around that to make sure we do a good job. So I just wanted to say that. The other thing I also wanted to say, so that our Treasury policy and the document that we've shared with you here incorporates, or the way it speaks to the Local Government Act is actually a thing we call a liability management policy, which is all about our borrowings and making sure that we have the right sort of practice and guardrails in place to keep things safe in that space. But it also talks to something we call an investment. I don't know if they use the word management again, but essentially it's an investment policy. And look, I did just want to say that's by and large the kind of property strategy conversation that's already kicked off, and Steph has been, and other people on exec have been sharing that with me, and we will be bringing forward another conversation on that, I think, as soon as next month. And I think just depending on how we get on with that and where we take that, I think we could naturally expect that we might just need to view back into the investment management policy and work out whether there are additional elements or things that we want to amend. So look, I guess the context today is just to understand we have these policies just like every other council up and down the land. They do some good stuff. I suspect that the Treasury management policies served the organisation pretty well over the years. But it does take us back into a discussion around debt to revenue ratios, interest to revenue ratios, and some other elements around our debt portfolio, and also incorporates practice and risk management around how we think about our investments. I didn't really have any major call outs and was really just kind of happy to take some questions.
Yeah. Absolutely, Claire, and then we'll go to Les.
Thanks, Nat. It was the change to the contingent liabilities, about Waikato Waters, and that's on page 7 of the policy and page 39 of our agenda, because it mentions that council is a guarantor and an indemnifier. Yeah, two different things. And I'm pretty sure that the setup is that we don't just guarantee our own borrowings, but we might also be responsible for others as well. I don't know if it's correct to call it joint and several. Yeah. And I just thought it might be quite helpful to put that in that paragraph. That's all, that it's not just our own borrowings, but that we could be responsible for the others as well.
Look, back through you, Jo. It's a good question, Claire, and I was pleased to see that the team picked that up. So we've just got it nice and clear that that's indeed a pretty fundamental part of the bedrock with Waikato Waters. I spoke with Neil this morning, actually. I would expect that it would be sensible for us to also include our guarantee relationships in respect of LGFA more generally, that some of you will be aware of.
And Claire, in doing that, I'm hearing you, and what I'm hearing is, we can include a little bit of, I don't know if I'd call it detail, but making sure we understand the joint and several nature of the guarantee. That can get a little bit complicated, and it effectively means, come the day that none of us want to see, it can get a bit messy. And it effectively means that it's not necessarily proportionate. But what I would also say is people would be pragmatic, and I would have thought they would be seeking a proportionate share of whatever the problem has been for the sector that could pop up one day. Okay.
Thanks, Ben. Les.
You were going to look into the LGFA. We've got a couple of large amounts to refinance, and they haven't actually set their interest rates, have they, yet?
So, Les, is it just a sort of a question on current rates? Where are they?
Yeah.
So maybe I'll just try and talk to some simple numbers as best I can. So we are needing to just pick up our loan book over the next few weeks and check in and see where we're at. I think I commented in a meeting recently, on average, a lot of our borrowings are reasonably short dated. In a sense, that's possibly served us reasonably well in terms of the cost of those borrowings, but it does come with the risk of, well, what happens if interest rates go up? We're a bit more exposed. And so it's all a balancing act. In terms of the actual numbers today, 3 to 5 year sort of borrowing at LGFA is going to be around the sort of 4.25% mark, maybe getting up towards 4.5%. So that's going to be the sort of territory that we would be looking at for a lot of those loans if we were in today's market.
They haven't set their rates for this year, have they?
No, and we need to be careful what we assume there. They couldn't afford to. They'd be taking too much risk if they just told us a year ahead what the rates are. They only eventually get set as they get ready to go to tender.
Thanks, Les. Right, I'll come to Shane and then Mayor Mike.
Yeah, I think it's a very sensible idea to have those LGFA covenants and the Treasury management policy together as one. Just looking at this, sort of alarm bell started ringing when I read the ability to borrow money and then make investments. And I'm interested in the fact that also that you've added a positive margin of at least 0.75%. So can you give me examples of this actually, what actually happens? It just seems alarming to me.
I'm sort of glad you asked the question, Shane. And I did see that adjustment myself, which was one of the reasons I wanted to say this is just in further reviews to go. We just need that to end up in a sensible place. So managing a big business with some decent outstanding borrowings, people use the term liquidity, you could say cash management. We've got an obligation to make sure that we've got access to cash to help manage our cash flow. We do that in a couple of ways. One is we've got a committed facility from one of the banks for a total amount of about 5 million, which we pay for the privilege of having, and there's a wee margin associated when we draw down on it. The team do a pretty good job in cash flow management, so they haven't had to utilise that facility too frequently. The other thing we will do, and look, again, it's early days and I need to engage a little bit more with the team and understand this a bit better, but it's certainly not foreign to me that you have to maybe carry a slightly bigger borrowing program in order to accommodate what we call an element of liquidity. So some, deposits with banks as a part of the overall portfolio. Indeed, in our relationship with LGFA, that is part of the requirement. Okay, so we just call it the management of liquidity risk. As a significant lender to the sector and us, they want some assurance that we've got sufficient cash resources on hand, that we don't get caught high and dry, because that can often just trigger problems. So what you're seeing in the policy at the moment is something that I'd like the opportunity to talk a little bit more with the team around, because I don't think we need to be curtailed by what the rate of interest mainly in the bank deposit market, is relative to our borrowing rate to decide whether or not we can manage our liquidity. We simply have to manage our liquidity first port of call, but then we can be a little bit balanced around when are we prepared to have a larger deposit book, when are we prepared to have a smaller deposit book. I was a little bit surprised at the idea that we needed to be comfortable we could get 0.75% margin before we would go there. So I don't know if that's partly what you're commenting on, but well, I can tell you in today's market that would be rather difficult to achieve because there's not a really big spread between bank deposit rates in the wholesale market, which is where we would be, and our own cost of borrowing. So we don't want to tie ourselves up in knots that we can't actually do what LGFA require us to do. Sorry about the long-winded answer, but you called out an area of this document where it stands at the moment that I want to do a little bit more work with.
Okay, well, I'm comfortable with the fact that you're focusing on it, and thank you.
Thanks, Shane. Then we'll go to Mayor Mike and then Les.
Thank you, through the chair. Well, I'm going to take a far more bullish approach to the exact same paragraph. Hey, over the years I've been involved with, we have done very well out of arbitrage. But I think a couple of years ago, we didn't do so well. So I think for us, anything in that space, we need to have good oversight over. That's not sort of, to me, just at staff level. But I remember Ken back in the day brought back some good figures and it definitely subsidised rates. So I'm very, very bullish when it comes to this stuff. If we can borrow at X rate and make a margin and there's no risk, and as our debt headroom, liquidity, all that sort of thing improves, to me, I look at every way to make $1 to reduce rates. So the bull and the bear.
Thank you. Les.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering, is there any idea where our debt ceiling is going to be with the FGA now that the water assets are removed?
Just that yesterday, Les, so I don't know if I can do the arithmetic on the top of my head, but
Thanks, Les. Any further questions or comments on the draft Treasury Management Policy? Mike.
I just want to make a comment on that though, just so it's nice and clear to the public. We've talked about this at least through the last council, so it's up to this council to decide. We always knew we were going to have a lot more debt headroom, and you've alluded to the fact that yes, we have, but it doesn't mean we're going to go and spend it, people, because at the end of the day, the ratepayer, whether it's water rates, our rates, the ratepayer is going to pay for it. So yeah, we're not going to go and fill this up. It would be my hope.
Thanks, Mike. Happy to hand back over to you guys if there's anything further you want to add. Otherwise, we can move on. Okay? Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Right. Let's move on to our next item, which is Introduction to Development Contributions. And I'll welcome Tony.
Morning, everyone. Yeah, I'm here to take you through the development contributions introduction, as well as just some reflection on the current policy provisions that we've had to date, and go a little bit more in depth than where we were previously in terms of the high-level overviews that have occurred. So, and we do have a few more elected members around the table here that have not been fully introduced to development contributions that some of the others might. So thought this would be a good time and a good time within the LTP to reflect on that and sort of move forward. This is also springboarded off the previous growth presentation we did back in May, which gave some idea around the scenarios that we were looking to adopt. And these are the scenarios that will then feed in through to this policy, as well as the wider LTP sort of projections. So if we go through here, the overview is going to be, again, around that introduction, a sort of a brief light touch into how they're calculated and assessed, updates through that previous LTP cycle that we had, and what we expect to be the next sort of policy direction. I will say that it does say to 2037, but it's likely going to be a transitional policy as we move to development levies if the next election goes the way of the National and the Coalition. So if we go through to this here, so these are the sort of elements that I'll look to cover. Won't go into too much detail here. But I thought this particular infograph is a really good one that sort of demonstrates the interconnectedness that development contributions has with pretty much the large majority of what happens with infrastructure around its costs and how it gets developed. This was developed by DIA in the first instance, this infograph, and this was what they wanted to use as development levies. So essentially, it's the same thing with development contributions. It's just looking at what we've got in play and what effect that might have on the contributions that we have to then charge out to the demand generators. And back in, say, 2017, councils had a high level of control of growth. Prior to that, we had the ability to control and restrict how many growth cells we had open. And I'm speaking to the medium density standard here as a effect base on how things changed. Back in 2020, you had the MPSUD for urban development, and that essentially took out council's control on growth cells, live zoned planning, etc., and the density requirements that were in there. So essentially, that's one of those effects base that is a legislative effect that we then had to feed into the development contribution policy, and then again into our infrastructure strategies, our growth strategies, and our financial strategies as a result. So it's just playing off that. That's why there's been changes in development contributions since then, and why there's going to be future changes as we move to development levies as well. So what are DCs? I did mention the word demand generators. So the word demand generators is really who is causing an effect on infrastructure you've planned for as growth. So is it a new granny flat that's in place that may have more water usage, another person living there, that's creating demand on what we plan for in the growth space relative to its area? Is it a new Fonterra building, that will be generating a lot more water usage, or are they managing their own waste and therefore not paying that element? So that's a demand generator. It's just a term that's used to determine who is actually causing effect on your infrastructure that you've planned for. They can only really relate to your capital expenditure. That is a legislative requirement under the LGA. They cannot relate to the consequential OPEX of that asset. That is then to be borne by the ratepayer and how those rates and levers are manufactured through that process. They have to be demonstrated through LTP. There needs to be transparency on what you're charging for to a demand generator, so that you can actually apply the charge to them when you're lodging to lodge the charge against them. They must have a causal nexus. And the causal nexus is, well, what are you putting in the ground and what are the effects on it? What are those demands generating through from there? And how we show that is through our funding areas, our funding maps, the projects associated with that funding area, and then the representative charge that's from there as well. So it's really just a fancy way of saying, what are you putting in the ground and who's going to be causing damage to it, that type of thing. We can include financing costs, and up until around about 2018, Waipawa District Council didn't have interest charges within their development contributions. They were a CapEx only charge. Since that time of that LTP round, we have included the full cost of interest. That did cause DCs to rise, and we have seen revenue increase as a result of that too. But it does allow for the full cost model of development contributions, paying for the debt servicing that we incur on the growth program itself. And then if the projects are not implemented through the LTP, that doesn't mean you don't have to implement them within the time period. You can adjust that time period to suit, and that's one of the many levers you've got available to you as elected members, is around your growth program and how you leverage and ensure that you're putting it in at the right time. But if you remove the project as a whole, whatever's been charged against the people that have paid must be refunded back to those people. And that can be quite an exercise to find those people, given the shell companies that get formed and developers. Yeah. So how are they used? Yeah, they really come down to being used as to recover the growth component of these seats. They have been your primary tool to date in terms of recurring and recovering all the costs associated with the growth demand. They are broken down to an activity base. There's 5 activity bases. So there's roading or transportation, reserves, community facilities, stormwater, wastewater, and there's actually 6 because I just remembered, water supply. I'm happy to take questions throughout.
You sure?
Yeah,
Okay,
sure.
Roger.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with our growth paying for growth policy, but not, as I understand it, not all local authorities or city councils, Hamilton City Council as an example, use that growth paying for growth philosophy. What do they do as a comparison to the methodology of funding, capital funding?
Yeah, I think it's, I think growth pays for growth is sort of like a political statement. And it's one that's fed through into the Going for Housing growth as well with National, with how they're looking to introduce new levers to enable that sentiment to be truly rectified. In Hamilton's instance, they've got quite a comprehensive model that's in terms of how they're not paying for it, but they try and spread that across other areas. But in terms of why growth is not paying for growth in their instance, they have areas that are excluded from having DCs. Their CBD, when Te Awa sort of came through, it really carved out the business sector within the CBD area. And so they, to incentivize growth back into the CBD, they put an exemption zone into the actual CBD area. So no DCs
So
applied.
does that become a general rates imposition of the
Correct.
costs
Yeah.
rather than a targeted?
Correct. Yeah. I wouldn't understand the full understanding of the levers that apply to those. They might have a targeted rate that overlaps with that city and brings them along the journey if they need anything within there. They also have capped and phased charging with certain areas as well to help the uptake in certain spaces. So the Peacocks area, the DC needed to be around 130,000, but they capped it around the 70K. And then they were bringing it up to 96,000 over 3 years. They thought through their modelling that eventually they would get to ensure that that revenue was coming online, but it's a long time in terms of how long you might install a project and its servicing that you're required to charge against. So they don't look at it in simple 3-year terms. They look at it the long total revenue projection that they're recovering against. And they're pretty confident on their annual revenue projections and their assumptions based on the detailed model inputs that they have and the staff that are feeding through to their full viability and of their development that's in their growth. Yeah.
Thanks, Roger.
Sorry, I'll go back to the last point there. And that kind of is a good segue with Hamilton, is that the private sector use these seats to help inform for them if a project is feasible to develop. It's one of the key costs that they have. They have a lot of costs that as they come on with development. Depending on the type of development, it can be anywhere between 5 to 20% of a project's cost to them. Land being the most expensive cost to them. But they have a lot of different factors that go into justifying a project, and they won't head into a project without having all of that baked into how they get the windfalls through there as well. So why do they matter? So they help to demonstrate as well as the development community that we have planned and enabled growth. They also help communicate to central government that, hey, we have planned effectively to enable the type of growth capacity that you have. So we've now done the results on the capacity side, we've done that on the demand side, and we've shown the infrastructure portfolio that is looking to bring that online. So that is a clear demonstration to, as a Tier 1 council to central governments at the time that we are meeting those MPSUD requirements. And then we go through to, it is just a tool for growth. It's not your only tool, but it is the main one that this council has deemed fit for the recovery of that CapEx. And this is just since 2008, we have recovered around 80 million in DCs, that's including GIST. And over the last 5 years, since those big uplifts of the land zoning from our Plan Change 13, that's a response to the MPSUD requirements, we have received more revenue in the last 5 years over that half than the wider. And that's a large proportion to the levers of including interest costs as well. So there is some levers that have been pulled through those policy provisions and charging that have led to more revenue as an associated result. And as we bring more projects online, the hope is that growth comes through from that, and the assumption that has been provided by the likes of market economics show that growth will continue to occur. It may not be to the same rate that we expected, but that's how we then smooth the programs out to ensure that we are recovering and just-in-time development is occurring in alignment with our expected investments through. The alternative means of DCs, we do have this Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act, which has had a lot of improvements over the past sort of 2 years. There's been a lot of changes to that. You did do an exercise under the last remit before any of the changes were made, which showed that it was quite a costly model to fund infrastructure or fund existing planned growth that would lead to quite high levies. And a lot of that was due to the financing cost that was around it too. They were exorbitantly higher than our standard LGFA covenants. But there's been a lot of work done in this space in particular to try and sharpen and refine and streamline the process to getting a substantial IFF off there. I will say that it's not special funding vehicle, it's special purpose vehicle that gets generated. And that's a levy that will sit on the beneficiaries that gets determined through that process. There's a couple that are sort of worked its way through, and they were under the old policy provision. There's the desludging plant in Wellington that was used, sort of $400 million project. And then TCC, they did a whole growth program of works for their roading networks within the city. And that was a 13 large-scale program that they could pick and choose what they were looking to do over that period of time. And that sit across the whole city area. And the levy would ramp up over time as those projects became online.
Tony, I've just got a question from Mike, if he can ask that now.
Yeah, look, it's just an information question also. So, and a question is around planned growth cells as to, and I'll just say planned changes that were unplanned. And just talk us through as a group, the difference in DCs, the difference in who pays for what and when DCs would be paid for, just in terms of what we'd plan to grow and what sort of comes to us as planned change that gets through the system.
Sorry, I've got two here. Happy for me to respond to that first? Or, yeah. So private plan changes, typically they occur either in areas that are not zoned for rural, or they are zoned as an area to come online in a specified time in alignment with our district plan. So in our area, we've got post 2035 growth cells, which we don't have any associated funding for to enable that growth to occur. Or rural areas where the growth is only expected to be sort of piecemeal and expected to be through boundary relocations and EVLs, etc. If a project was to come online, or a plan change was to come online, they would have to articulate the effects of infrastructure on us. So they would have to articulate to us what's your expected water consumption, your wastewater, your roading, etc., and how are you going to serve that community from a communal basis around reserves, and make sure that you're interconnecting and integrating seamlessly with our existing urban extents or rural extents. We would then expect through the growth principles and expect through our current provisions that any identified infrastructure through whatever modelling has determined an effect
on our core infrastructure would be paid in full by that developer that's bringing that online. So if that wasn't planned in our infrastructure portfolio. If there was infrastructure that was planned, there can be some leeways in how we transfer and work through a development agreement to bring that infrastructure online ahead of when we might have had it planned, or we might have planned for it to be online and this is just a consequence of that coming on. So they might tie in seamlessly with planned works that we have. Under our current policy provisions, we do have an adjacent DC provision. So essentially, if you're in an area and you're close to our area, whatever funding area is there would be the adjacent provision that you're charged to the base. And so a good example would be the T4 private plan change. If that was to be eventuated and progressed, they would need to bring on the minimum charge of the Te Awamutu catchment, because that's the one they tie to. So that's our urban infill catchment area. And then if there was anything associated with the infrastructure effects, it's full cost to them. Yeah.
Tony, right ahead, Pip, and then Roger.
From the accounts for sort of circa 30 June, before we had assets and debt transferred to Waikato Waters, my understanding at a macro level, we have debt associated with growth sitting circa 230 million.
Yes,
and we have development contributions owed to the council of circa 75 million. Is that correct?
Those are assessed. So those are against live projects. They're not owed to us as we must have them now. They are payable at the time that a consent comes in for certification. So those are a record of what planned development is in train and has been approved by the council. The outstanding amount is what we expect to receive once they come in for their certification. So it's not an outstanding debt on our books.
Okay, but we would expect to receive those funds on the basis that the development went ahead.
Correct, yes.
If you look at the difference between that 230 number and the 75 number, my comment yesterday was that we have potentially overinvested in infrastructure, given that differential of whatever that is, sort of $150 million or thereabouts. How's that being covered on the basis that we've spent that $230 million for those growth assets, but we can't foresee addition of that money coming back to pay debt? And also my understanding is that the interest costs associated with that debt is not allocated to the rates bill, but effectively is capitalised, which further increases the liability of further developers who are going to develop that land. And so my question is, if the land is sold at a very slow rate and the interest costs are accrued to the existing land, aren't we transferring the interest costs to potential acquirers of those future developments?
So the baseline of what happens to that 150 million and what we've got remaining, that resides on the balance of land that isn't developed. So areas that's and they're forecasted within the forecast of our growth to come online, and that's how we in turn use the model to set a rate that covers the longevity of how long that project is residing on our balance sheet. So the DC has the project level, a return period on it, and we will cover it off in other slides, that demonstrates that the developer now is paying for the interest over the entirety of that project that is causing that. So they are paying a fee based on how long we expect the growth uptake to be in the entire cell in the first instance.
But if the growth uptake is slower than we expect, where does the cost differential, because there's obviously holding costs
from what, Matt's saying, it's sort of 4.5%. So, and I understand that we were planning on a 3.6% growth rate, but in actual fact, we ended up at about 1.5, and the difference is quite substantial.
I'll try and cover it off in other slides, Pip, because it might be beneficial to talk it through with a live project.
Okay.
So
I just had Roger. Roger, do you want to come in now or do you want to wait?
No, I think that my question was similar, and it's to do with development agreements where there is an establishment of DCs at the beginning. And please handle this when you get to the slide. But if there is a request to defer payment of DCs, how is the equitable allocation of the additional interest that's created by that deferment? So just handle that next when you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tony.
I'll try and capture that through a few of the next slides. But this here is around the development of your DC charges in the first instance. So these are the factors that go into how we charge the full DC. So as I say, what are DCs there? They're a cost of your growth, and that's taking into account your existing expenditure, what has already been committed, your existing assessments, that DC outstanding amount that's sitting there, the 75 mil, the infrastructure projects and works and agreements that sit behind those, and any land acquisition that we still have remaining to enable the full growth to occur. The underlying part, the future units of growth, that's resounding to the amount that's still outstanding, but also that balance property. So the balance amount of the growth that's occurring, that feeds into what we expect that uptake to be. So all of that is the future forecasting around what is happening with that residual balance land based on what you've already got committed here and when you expect that to come online, and the remaining property that's sitting in there. We feed that all through our model, which is also used by Manamata Piako and Waikato District Councils. We all bought the same model through CoLab, and it was Insight Economics that developed the model, and we've been using it since 2014. So it's this similar model that is used. That spits out all those factors that we have there, spit out the DC charge, and they spit out the expected, what we in turn can use to assess development agreements and what should be required in there. They also help us determine DC assessments. So what are you actually going to be charging for your consent that you bring to the door with us now?
Yeah, go Claire.
Just back at that, could you explain what commercial feasibility
Yeah.
means in that? Yeah.
So that speaks to the, and I've put it in red because it's probably where we're light in that space around our data and analytics. The commercial feasibility is essentially, is a project viable for them to go through? And I back to HCC's reference around how they determine these. They've got 2 doctors of economy. They've got coding skills in-house. They have a model that checks things at a parcel level and determines 38 different variabilities that can determine whether a project is good to go or not. And that's at a parcel level and a theoretical, this area could be developed or not. We don't have that. That is something that is, I'm not suggesting we have that. But what I'm saying is that is the level of detail that some complexity has gone into to around how growth can occur. For us, that is now externally provided at the moment through Market Economics. They have assessed the population projections. They've assessed parcels and reviewed the aerial photography as well, and run through their own model what our expected reasonably to be realised will be on a year-by-year basis. And they've done that up to roughly 2075. So that's the level of external validation that we didn't have through the last LTP. And largely that was due to the fact that the census data at that time was not available to help feed into those models. And we had a huge gap between the most available data, which was 2018, and our previous projections, where we were already recording at year 2031 of those census projections. So we were a lot out of kilter with that, which made it very difficult for us to put in an assumption that was robust enough for audit to really sink their teeth into to say, yep, you've hit the nail on the head. So here's that DC calculation. I've picked one project. The model has 156 different projects within it, but I thought, why not just start with one? So essentially this project here is the transportation provision for C4, which came into play with the last LTP. As you can see there, it's got different factors that feed into getting a defined rate for you. But the overall cost there, that's around 18.4 million. That covers a few roundabouts, that covers collector roads internal to that growth cell, and it recovers the lander cost associated with it. 4.5% is the interest rate that would be applied to any loan within that project specific. So every single project of those 156 has the same interest. We apply the same interest that's determined through from BERL in our LTP. Then it has a defined growth percentage. So the main purpose of this project was growth, 77%. The residual 23% was based on the existing Cambridge Road renewals and a level of service upgrade that was required. So that's the Kaipaki Silverwood Lane urbanisation and intersection itself. That was externally validated by Grey Matter Consultants at the time when we developed that project. The return period is the length of time we expect this cost to sit on our balance sheet. And that return period is the period of time that it sits across the balance of that land. So when we get a charged DC against the live project, it is sitting against an expected time period of 25 years for the specific project charged at that 1 HU level. Then we also feed into what has already been spent to help understand what is drawn down from to feed into that interest calculation, the future costs remaining, and what's already been paid to date. So that gets balanced out of there. This is from 2023, so these numbers have changed. We've received more revenue in this space than what we've currently showing you. But this is when the DC rate was set. That this is when we fed it through the model, and this is the number that gave us, and then we could either annually adjust or adjust through the LTP. The units of growth that it is divided by are 925, and that's based on what you might expect to be developed in your planned capacity, and then validated by what is actually on the ground at a parcel level. That takes into account both C4's remaining capacity as well as C11. And that's why that project's out to 25 years, is because it's actually got a clause in it that, as opposed to 2035 growth cell, that does need to pay that share as well. And that's where that delay in equity share comes into play, around having a growth cell that's not online yet, but then we're still applying that it would be causing the demand onto it and therefore setting the rate as it were. Then you finally get the HU rate specific to roading in this growth cell, which is included of GST. That's a whole model run. The model runs all 156 projects, runs all the catchments that we have assigned to them, and then spits out a number that's dedicated to them. It may have overlapping catchments. There may be some projects that are not only C4 or C11, but they might be Cambridge-wide. That was all fed through and developed internal to the model. If the interest wasn't applicable to this, that rate would be around about 19,000. So interest for this one is around 2.5K per unit that we expect over that 25 return period. So that is essentially how we ensure that the equity at the time and how much we know at the time is charged to defining that rate. If growth doesn't occur in that space, those assumptions are changed. I'll go back to there as well, sorry. If growth didn't come online that was expected in that return, the return period of that time period would change. It would change to a higher return period, therefore more interest and a higher charge. So those are, we reflect and review those on an annual basis to see if we're still in alignment with our forecasted revenue, make the assumption to either rerun the model or not if we're meeting certain requirements. And
rerunning the model takes time, but it's also a review against, well, what have you spent in your growth program? Is that valid that you would actually look to run that again? But when you must review these numbers every 3 years, and that's when we sort of tie it in with the LTP and any more assumptions that we can build in. So say we didn't get the growth in the C4 catchment, the return period on the projects would increase. The units would still remain the same. They would just spread out over a longer period of years, and the HUU rate would go higher as a result.
Claire, and then Pip, did you have a question too?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. The question I have is about the interest component. Yeah, because you're talking about quite long periods of time. And is there some sort of control in your model that might say you hit a point where you think that interest component is getting beyond the point where a developer might be willing to actually commit to develop? Yeah, because I think the DC is too high, and it's not because of the infrastructure, it's because of those holding costs with the interest. Yeah.
So there isn't a model trigger of this rate has become too high that we feel it's not applicable. It would really be based on, well, what is the overall rate looking like? Is that still something we're comfortable submitting out, or do we feel that this is actually going to be quite crunchy for a developer to do that? And then that's a conversation that once we've settled on the growth program, settled on what our interest rates are and our policy levers, that we would then come to you with the rates to say whether or not, hey, this is starting to look a bit too exorbitant. At the end of the day, a developer will develop it if it's feasible enough for them. And that would be based on what the windfall is at the end of it and what they've imposed and what people are willing to pay on a land site. So that really is a test of the market and a response of the market to basically the rates are set out. And no developer is going to tell you that they want to see higher costs. They will say it's going to incur a windfall cost, which is true. That will go baked into the land price, which then is picked up by that new homeowner. Yeah.
And just a supplementary, have we ever been in a situation at Waipa where you've had to come to the council because you think the DCs are too high, or that it could be a risk?
No, the last time where I thought they were getting high was last LTP, which they admittedly they are high, but it's reviewing that not just internal to Waipa, but also reviewing that against other organisations as well. So that's where we did an analysis last LTP where we looked at Auckland City Council's DCs, which they were pretty high, Matt. Still are. And then also Hamilton City, we looked at theirs. We looked at the build of TCC and how they do things slightly differently. They have a land charge and then they have a building charge on top, but the overall cumulative was higher. But it's really that those high costs affect the latest growth cells because the interest is baked in over a long period. Interest was higher than when it was previous. Infrastructure costs are way higher than what they were back when we had 1 or 2 cells open. But yeah, so the viability of those, we have seen development still occurring in those cells. Yeah.
Pip.
If one was to look at a different project, which is probably almost close to completion, have we got projects which are almost all of the units within it have been sold and contributions sort of got back? And are there examples whereby we're going, we miscalculated, we've actually got, we haven't collected enough, and therefore we as the entity will be wearing the capital costs associated with it?
So the best example of a mature growth cell would be Cambridge North. The cell there, that's been a long period of time. That's been online for since 2006, I think. There's still residual pockets of land that are available to develop. The infrastructure was costly at the time for us, not as costly as it is now, but the DC rate is actually lower than when it was the year prior. in terms of what it comes to. So it's 35,000 now for that DC, whereas previously it was 45,000. And so it depends on the different levers that go into it. And the reason it was lower was because the previous assumptions on what the land could develop in, its units of growth, was 12 to 15. But when you add the medium density standards in and the enablement of the planning that can occur in there, it went to 35. So its units of demand were higher over the residual balanced land, and therefore the overall rate was lower. That could apply on a single HEU basis. So that's the most mature growth cell we have, where we have developed the costs, we have reviewed them, and we've recovered a decent chunk of revenue, but they've actually gone lower than where that is. There are ones where we have developed a huge amount of infrastructure that they're going to take time before we can really determine okay, we're not going to see this growth coming in. If that does come through the modelling around anything like that, then that's where we look at other things like the different levers to ensure that our risk profile is minimised. So with the new tethers and IFF, there are abilities to ring fence out the remaining parcels and recover revenue through an IFF levy as well. So, and there's also targeted rates that is a lever that can apply to those areas as well. So there are still, it's not a oh no moment. It's okay, well, what policy provision and lever are you going to apply to ensure that that growth is paying for that growth in that area? I'll also say that development levies provide a more aggregate approach. So an area won't have that causal nexus issue around being able to recoup the costs only against one area. So you'll be able to balance it over a community area, and that will then de-risk a specific cell that comes into play.
Thanks, Tony. Roger. And then Shane.
And mine's on a similar vein. I'm using a particular example here, which is C3. And we had a concept plan on which the DCs were established. Then through the change to the density, we've had a large number of higher density sections developed there, which has put strain onto the infrastructure provision of parking, et cetera, which will change this equation. How do we handle that? And how do we enable the catch-up of that infrastructure and the recovery of the cost of that?
So that's kind of where it bleeds into, well, what is your level of service change as well? Because the growth has actually occurred. So what is the strain on your new assets as a result of that? And therefore, is it a growth program that can feed in, because you can't actually recover against what's already present? It becomes more a strain of infrastructure as a result. And that's a council level decision around your level of service that you're willing to accept or not. So you can only charge for what you've planned for. And if something that comes as arisen that we haven't been able to plan for or foresee, exactly, that's where the ship has kind of sailed on a DC side, but it doesn't mean you don't have other levers. And hopefully with that resultant growth that's occurred, that cost is spread thinner across those people. So it can't feed back into the model, and you can't go back for another bite at the cherry with what you've recovered. But you do have an ability to review your level of service and either live with that decision for your community, or if your community is telling you it's not great, then we feed it into there. If the modelling showed that that project had a resultant further addition to growth that could benefit from this, say it's an extra 2 car parks or whatever, then there is potential that a percentage of that project may feed into the DC model itself. But that would need to be reviewed and validated as well.
Shane.
From a P&L budgeting level, historically, Waipa hasn't been very good at predicting what the recovery will be for development contributions. In fact, quite a way out. So going forward, I know we've done a lot of focus on growth and understanding it better. And going forward, do you think we're in a position now that we can better predict in our P&L, in our budget, what the recoveries will be?
I would say we've still got a way to go. They're very tricky, and I don't have a 38 model commercial feasibility to provide the answer on the determining of the right variability. What we are noticing and what we have picked up on is trends and how long a consent may stay live, how long do they last for, how much can they lapse. The more control in the space around DA setting than previous as well are all ways in which we can tighten up how we do ensure that growth occurs. I'll also say that with development levies and aggregate charging, the ability to just define it to consents and get a more realistic track of revenue is no longer lumpy with just one sort of development. It will be spread across wider development, and because we can predict that wider building consent level, we can then in turn predict a more certain level of revenue that may be smoother than previous. Yeah, for DLs. Yeah, that's right. And a lot of that does stem back to a problem statement that was developed back last year around data integration with growth as well, because there's a huge thing that occurs with what you develop as your growth program and the ongoing consequence of that as well. Like there's not a huge ability to capture that ripple of what you do over here and how does that impact over here. And the problem statement was around data integration with growth and capital delivery. That was put on pause until we understood where the second half of the bill with development levies was going around national prescriptions, because it's better to do it once and ensure that what we were doing in that space was going to integrate with the future requirements, because development levies will be regulated through Commerce Commission. They won't be regulated under, which aren't currently regulated.
Thanks, Tony.
So I've got the slide here around when DCs are assessed and undertaken. So these are the types of applications that councils can charge a DC against. Subdivisions, it's pretty standard. It's a residential. You've got 10 lots and we'll charge you 9 because you have a credit for your existing house on there if there was one. Land use is, those ones are a bit trickier. They are based on whatever activity you are. So say you're an office block, we'll ask for your demand, we'll review that, assess your consent and spit out a number that is fair and reasonable with the demand that you might expect. Building consents, we've got 2 ways of charging that. That is looking at your gross floor area. If you're going higher than a certain gross floor area, then we'll charge you an additional charge on top. Or if you're under a PIM process as well, we will charge you the relevant DC that's applicable under a PIM. And then for a service connection, that can be a dedicated one to, say, water or wastewater, because we are still administering those for the Waikato Waters for the foreseeable future, as well as stormwater. So, and we can withhold that service connection until that payment's occurred. The assessment of demand of infrastructure, that's where you take that relative consent and you apply the funding area that's applicable to it. The funding areas are all shown in the DC policy, and they reflect the relevant catchments and the projects that are associated with them. The notice then gets issued and forms part of that decision that goes out to the applicant. So it's tied to them at that point, and they must show evidence of that payment and when they come to seek certification of that consent. So that's where there can be some real differences in timing. A developer has about 5 years to get a subdivision consent to us before it lapses. And if it were to lapse, the DC is not payable, and we rerun that same balance land back through the model to feed in what the new rates will be in that new period when we do a reassessment. So yeah, the DCs are, again, they're assessments, they're not invoices, so they don't sit on our books as sunk cost or debt that's incurring interest. That they are just an assessment that gets notified and then they pay it through to us. And we won't satisfy the consent or certify the consent relative to any one of those types of applications before we see the evidence of payment to us. And that is essentially the assessment criteria. I've also got the DC delegations here around who assesses them and how we enter those sorts of contracts. But I thought it was also important to put where the elected members sit in this process. So up the top, you set essentially the scenarios that take it based on our advice, which unfortunately at a tier 1 level gives you high growth. And then, well, where do you take that high growth within those scenarios? The financial levers you look to pull, do you want to stay with DCs or do you want to go a different tack, those types of things, or do you want to charge interest on your DCs or not? Those are the other types of levers that go through those means. And then ultimately set the growth program. And that's fed through from whatever scenario you've chosen and how we best feel that infrastructure needs to come online to reflect that growth scenario. And that helps set our DCs as a result of that. Then when we go to the assessment criteria, so Steph or 2 different directors can sign off on a development agreement or approve a DC assessment over $1 million. When we get to the level 2 officer, that's where I get involved with anything up to 1 million, or I'll recommend to the likes of Steph and run it past Matt here if it's the right sort of approach to take with this one. And that also goes through for reconsiderations. So the developer has a right to request a consideration of have we applied the policy wrong. And then that gets reviewed by an independent or another member of my staff to see if that rate has been applied. And if it has, then we'll adjust. If it hasn't, then we stick to that, and then they can go through an objection process. And then offer refunds as well. So we have the ability to offer a refund or, it's a refund based on the merits of demand allocation to it. It may... I don't think we've really offered many refunds in this instance, only if they're providing infrastructure that's unplanned. So I think there's been 2 cases of a fire hydrant where we've provided that we weren't meeting our level of service requirement, growth was occurring, and we ensured that they could get some remission for the cost of that fire hydrant based on their water DC. And then we've got Development Contribution Officer, that's Megan. She assesses the bulk of our individual developments that come online. She reviews all the subdivisions, she reviews all of the building consents and connection applications that get lodged to council. And that DC Commissioner, that really goes through the process of an objection. An objection is quite a onerous process. We've never done one at council. They roughly happen about 2 to 3 times a year across the whole nation. And they relate to an objection to how you've administered the policy. So the rate that gets applied is not argued. That's not something that the DC Commissioner can unpick. So just saying that the cost is too high is not something that any applicant can do. Has the policy been incorrectly applied to how you're doing that? And so we've had no objections here. There's been several in Hamilton, I believe, but and some of those have had good outcomes and some of those have had poor outcomes, but they help also determine future policies and future legislation.
Tony, I've got a couple of questions.
Sure.
From Pip first and then Shane.
Yep. I'm very conscious that growth and this whole development area hugely impacts our balance sheet. And yet the delegated authorities is basically to the chief executive and not through to the council. So we've got a situation where delegated authorities goes to the CEO, where traditionally the degree of exposure that we have by way of sort of assets and liabilities and therefore the balance sheet basically doesn't get to the board or council. And also we have a scenario whereby now that some of these developments are lagging behind and the developers are up for various payments because their developments are slow, which particularly sort of post mid-22 when developments have slowed down. And yet, once again, the CEO gets to sign off on changing development contribution and any agreements with developers, which once again, we don't get any understanding of at a governance level. So how do we understand from a governance level what our level of exposure is becoming, because effectively operationally the balance sheet is controlled effectively at an executive level.
Yeah, I will. I'll try to answer in part, and then I might defer to Steph because it is a delegation decision and it's not something that sits within the development contribution policy itself. But we do come to council for if a contract is tied to a development agreement that may have an alteration to the planned growth itself. So development contribution offsets with IWAs. You may have recalled we came through to council with the C4 IWA development agreement through public excluded. Those are areas where the overarching development agreement doesn't stop the responsibility of contract levels with IWAs. So if they're tied to an IWA, there will be a ability that council comes through and requests approval over a contract sum of 2 million. And if there's any land decisions that are a part of this process, because land still needs to be acquired through that process. So any development agreement that comes to you that has some of those other tethers tied to other to delegated authorities will come through to council. So the large scale ones where land or all those contracts exceeding a certain value will come through public excluded. But I might defer to Steph with regards to delegated authority and how those decisions are made.
Yeah, just because I've got a supplementary that Steph will answer, but it's based on what he's saying.
Okay.
So when you talk, you mentioned that level 1 delegated authority will make a decision in, no interest or interest. So what example would you have no interest? I would have thought you would have want always to have interest, but.
The interest component would be, so deferrals prior sale arrangements don't stop the requirement for the payment to come through. They require them to pay at the time that they notify us of a sale of the land. So they still are required to pay that residual in there. They also may have offsets applicable to your growth planned. So the program is that you won't expend the cost related to an asset that comes online. So a good example is saying we're building a new roundabout. We are seeking to defer the cost, but we will not be paying, we'll do that roundabout for you, essentially. The cost of that roundabout is baked into their project, their development itself. And because we're not imposing a charge on them for that aspect, the balance of that DC for different activities could be offset in terms of a deferral. So the interest is that you wouldn't apply additional interest because it's already baked into the DC levy that was set. If there was no project that was associated with it and there may be some reason that a deferral may be offered, then interest would apply. But it's typically just related and tethered to assets that come online through our growth program because we're not incurring interest on that program because we're not actually doing that work.
Yeah, so it's actually not a decision to not have interest. It's just in that case you wouldn't.
Yeah.
So it's probably not right to say that they're making that decision in actual fact.
Steph, did you want to come in here or are you happy for us just to carry on?
Thanks, Jo. I just I can't see Pip's face. Zoom is not that sophisticated, so I'm not sure whether he's feeling that he's got the answer to his question. And I'm interested, whether do you need me to comment or would you like to move on?
Are you happy, Pip?
I'm just interested, as I said, we've got a big component of effectively the balance sheet and our gearing, etc. And yet we are, it's unlike a commercial entity that will have a particular project and you're sort of signing off sort of a big capex. We seem to have lots of individual decisions that are directly impacting our assets and our liabilities and therefore our balance sheet. And yet we don't actually we get control of the little portions of it, but we don't see the whole thing until we see the sets of financial accounts.
Okay. I hear what you're saying, Pip, and you can see how complicated the whole development contribution space is. And I just want to acknowledge Tony for being able to explain this. I think probably, like many of you, I'm sort of left with also some questions of clarification, just reminding myself too about some things. But Tony, you've done a great job of explaining this. Pip, I think what I would say is I would always err on the side of caution about comparing us to a commercial entity. But at the same time, the principles of good governance mean you need to get over, you set the policy like we've got in front of you. You set the delegations approvals for the organisation, and then we have to go away and operationalise it, which you know. So apologies for speaking the obvious, but what we are reviewing at the moment as part of the growth program too is, have we got those settings right? Not just reporting, but where those delegations sit, have we got sensitive enough support business mechanisms for Tony to be able to aggregate this and in real time being able to watch what it means for our organisation, given the complexity of the situation, which he's just outlined very well. So I think, and if you think about the in terms of my reflections on the alterations to IWAs or other agreements that I've had when I've been here, compared to the overall size of the balance sheet, they're actually, and Tony, disagree with me or correct me if I'm wrong, are actually not that big in scale. So we're not, you know, and it's all relative. So I understand your point. I'm just wondering how much more bureaucracy and administrative procedure we'd put in if we had dropped that, if we pushed that level up to councillors, and how much that would potentially, does it affect the business being able to operate versus governance feeling like it's got enough oversight of the business to be comfortable with what it needs to have to make good decisions and monitor. So I understand I hear what you're saying. I think there's a nuance in there, and I think we're going to keep looking at that and making sure we've got that right.
I'm just very conscious that a lot of our community are looking at you know, Waipa District Council has $400 million worth of debt, which is now $184 million less now that we've got it off. But in order to do that, we had to increase their water rates by 19.1% in order to make it justifiable. But still now they're saying, hey, listen, you've got $200 million worth of debt, which effectively is sort of sitting with the members. And I think, you know, our community deserves some understanding of how we ended up getting the $200 million, because we say, you know, growth pays for growth. So don't worry, we've got this covered. We've got a couple of $100 million worth of debt, but, you know, we're a growth council and it's all going to work out in the end. And people going, I don't know if I actually understand how it's all happening, which is one of the reasons, you know, we've generally requested what we've got here today, because I'm very concerned that we want our community to understand that we are running a well-balanced organisation and that we're not over-investing, and we haven't done too much development, because ultimately it's our community that takes responsibility for it.
So in short, a reply would be, it's a very complex situation, right, Pip? I'm sure you'll agree with that. It's not something that's easily explainable. Councils have the responsibility and keep getting, particularly when the policy came down for the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, this council needed to work at speed to be able to meet the requirements of that. They thought they'd done a great amount of work that would provide for what we needed. That then became irrelevant and they had to pivot and do something else. So I think there's some tension between thinking that this is a business, this is not a normal business. We are the public service and we're an infrastructure provider. So it's about, as you say, being very clear about the why. Why are we doing this? What's our role? What does central government require of us? Having that sensitivity to the market and what's moving on, but actually having a very good structure, processes, business supports and people in the organisation to make sure we're doing this sagely and wisely. I'm not sure that any council would put their hand up across the country and say they've got this perfect. I'm interested in what Matt would say from an Auckland perspective. I take your point, but I don't think this is ever going to be an easy sell to the public. But what I need to be sure of is that you, as the elected members, are very clear about what we're doing and why, and you're comfortable with it. I think also people don't understand how debt is used in public infrastructure, that it allows for intergenerational investment. It's not like household debt. It is a much broader set of debt usage and parameters, and we have to think about 100-year timeframes, which not many households are doing. And I think that is always something that is valuable to think about in the public arena as well. But I think I'll leave it there, Jo, and we can continue these conversations, and I hear the concerns that Pip is expressing.
Thanks, Steph. No, that was valuable. Matt, I'll come to you.
Look, not too much to add. It's just good to listen in. Pip, I do think you're making some good points around just visibility, governance, confidence, public confidence. I totally understand. There is a reality that you exercise that through the annual and LTP budget process. And so maybe at this stage, I'll just offer in that listening to this and thinking about it, and we almost touched on it a little bit yesterday, I think what we could do as a team is just think about how we make a distinct growth program decision-making process through the annual budget, through the LTP, where it's almost a bit more of an expose. So what are the risks? Here are the risk elements. Here's why we're recommending this. Just been really clear about the potential variation in revenue, because no one's got a perfect crystal ball. Wouldn't matter who walked in here, no one owns that, right? So we could, I think, quite usefully just move to a process where in approving and agreeing those budgets, whether they're annual plan or LTP or 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, there's always this sense that the growth program within that and the way in which we are being transparent about the risks and how they're being managed is just very clear to governors. I think we could probably do that, but yeah.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, happy for you guys to carry on.
Sure. So I'll move on to what we did last time, essentially. So we updated the assumptions. That was that whole thing around not having the census data that really meant that how we were trying to project things was based off a sort of what had occurred between 2018 to 2023 period, and they'd seen a 7-year difference between it now showing 2031. So that's a high trajectory. So the assumptions built in we're looking at that outstanding revenue balance of the DCs and then projecting out from that year 4. So that was that previous annual plan. We've now had the census data come in. We now have reviewed that with Market Economics to provide us a robust, externally validated data source against the projections that we can then use as our model base. So a lot different to just an interpolation of data when we don't have that census information. And going forward with the census no longer being actually activated and the Te Nera using live data sources that generate from the different ministries, we'll be able to run models as and when a lot more frequently than using just a base unlive data set that gets revised every 3 years. There are some risks involved with that. Te Nera have indicated that that data is not as valid as the census data. So there will be some changes that they'll caveat in terms of future projections and probably a wider range of what the growth scenarios are at a higher or lower level. We introduced gross floor area ranges. So previously we just had you're this cell, you're this lot, and they're charging you this one. But then we looked at some of the houses that were coming through with 2 kitchens or coming through with 3 or 4 bedrooms. They were going to generate more demand on those areas. And we used some of the work that Matt's financial team had done around gross floor area projections, and they were actually a good, suitable approach that we decided to take. And we have seen some abilities to charge additional costs through that. So if you're over 250 square metres of a property for your actual building, you'll be charged a 0.2 extra in HEU. So, and we've received quite a lot of revenue in that space and some contention, but that's always healthy. We've added additional interest to development agreements. Largely that was due to the fact that you did have interest baked into these previous DCs at 2.5 or 2.29, I should say. The interest doubled, and it's only fair to now, if you're not providing an asset through, like I was talking before, Shane, around not providing anything that's a benefit in that regard, that we would be able to apply an additional surplus interest on top of the DCs that come through if you're deferred, say, 12 to 24 months. And then the provision for supporting Papakāinga developments was put in place. That was a direct reflection of some of the requirements that came through from central government around enabling Māori general land to be enabled. And we saw that this was a really good outcome to just try and streamline the process through and get some associated development uptake in those Papakāinga developments that we received. And so the Wesley Road one is a good example where DCs were revoked in that instance. Then we can move on to.
Just got a question from Ange. Nice that you're joining us, Ange. Thank you very much for being here.
Apologies for lateness. I just had some other stuff I had to sort. Tony, just a real quick question. When you said about the interest being charged, does that on if there's delays, is that only when the delays caused by the developer? You know, just say it was something that we couldn't do that caused the delay. Would the developer still be responsible for the interest because it's pushed them out?
Well, so the interest comes online from when the agreement gets signed. So typically they come in and request an agreement just before they lodge their 224 application. So they've already built everything. They're not wanting to pay at that point. And so it's not something that we have caused that they would ask for a development agreement. It's a request from them to streamline their revenue as their development comes online. That interest would be applicable from the date of the agreement to the end term, and it will be based on the balance of what's residually paid. So say it's a 100 lot subdivision, say they sold 50 in that 12-year time, or that 2-year time. They would then be responsible for the interest on the 50 remaining at that 24 month. Yeah, on the balance. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, Ange. Roger.
Yeah, and Tony, this is the first time we've seen reference to Papakāinga, and it's a general question here that you may not be able to answer, but I go back a number of years ago and we were going to establish a policy on Papakāinga, if you recall, but we actually deferred that because there were some government initiatives coming out to cover that. Is it possible for us to have an update, not now, but at some stage, on what our progress is with Papakāinga? Because I think there was a real intention from around this table to actually get some progress on that.
I can note that with the strategy team and come back to you. Yeah.
I will just note that we do currently have Papakāinga provisions in our district plan already. They were just an update to those Papakāinga provisions to reflect the actual mana whenua in those relative areas. Yeah.
Thanks, Tony.
And then I'll just move, we kind of have touched on this quite a lot with regards to DAs, but they are essentially a further tool that can be used to work with a developer to best get the best, more accurate costs associated with growth infrastructure. So that's where you have those offsets, that's where you have additional interest implications, and those are the sorts of financial benefits that council may look to use in terms of entering that development agreement. It is at our discretion to approve a development agreement. We don't have to. If we don't feel that we're actually going to get a discernible benefit that would meet one of these characteristics. And since the last LTP, we have declined several development agreements because they haven't actually met the calibre of what would be a benefit to council. That has been escalated up, and then we've provided the right feedback in terms of being able to assist in saying that this is declined for XYZ reason. So it's not a direct requirement that you must sign up to a development agreement. It is solely your discretion. So this is the sort of key takeaways from today. DCs are complex. And they're built off a large number of different assumptions. And I stress that they are assumptions. They are not set in stone. They are things that will fluctuate and float, and no one has a crystal ball on how growth might occur. It is something that you update and you react and you look back on future LTPs or past LTPs and you try and bring them through to your future. The minor adjustments that we're recommending are a light touch, and that's just in response to that we will have some development levies coming through. Even if this coalition government doesn't get in, it has been suggested that this is supported by the different side as well. It will just be a timing thing with anything that changes and change in governments would occur. But there's a real desire to see a more aggregated approach to how we spread the risk of this growth across the actual people that will be generating demand on it. So we still haven't seen that second half of the bill. We did a first submission in partnership with the Development Contributions National Executive Board back in February of this year, which was supportive of the provisions that were coming in development levies. And we hope to see that sort of still come through, even with the lobbying that was happening on the other side as well. So we'll wait and see. Early indication is that we might see something into September, but we'll very much let you know either via On the Radar or through a workshop that will continue on with how we set these rates.
Thanks, Tony. I'll go Mayor Mike and then Claire.
Just on that, Tony, I was going to bring it up. Would it be worth putting in it, because there are changes coming and this government's definitely hoping to get them through before the 24th, would it be worth setting a tentative workshop that we could pull rather than try and put it in at last minute? Because I think there's going to be a lot of change around all this sort of stuff, and to have us over it would be good.
Yeah, I think our program already has a scheduled workshop for DC's updated before the election, before October, I believe so, yeah.
Yes, thanks, Tony. I was actually going to raise the issue of parking provision. Yeah, because it didn't quite fit in any of your other slides, but I understand that the legislation means that we're not obliged to require developers to provide for parking on site anymore. But, you know, we're obviously seeing the effects of insufficient parking now that new developments are especially with commercial. Yeah. Is there any way that the current DC approach allows us to do that on a more sort of on a broader or even community level?
So that parking provision was removed under another MPSUD around 2019, and that was a reflection of the Auckland Unitary Plan, and that sort of going from that level through to a more nationwide. So it has been a thing since then. The ability to include it in here would probably be more an outcome of what do you plan for in your growth program to enable more car parks. So are you providing growth within your, are you providing a supplementary program that would target local roads to have more parking provision, or are you putting your regulatory hat on and saying you should be putting more parking on in your local roads? Or are you providing it at a program-based level where you allocating a percentage of growth relative to more car parks that you have in a whole bucket that you're doing? Because it wouldn't be just the growth that's causing the need for more parking as well. It would be the aggregate of your level of service change. Yeah.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Tony. Oh, sorry, Marcus. Apologies.
Sorry, can you just give us a quick answer about how this policy relates to Waikato District Council and South Waikato in case of like if merger happens or whatever?
Yeah, they have their own DC policies. They with Waikato using the same model as us, so it's relatively easy to stitch in. South Waikato, pretty unfamiliar with their DC policy. I'm not even sure if they have one, but I'll double check on that. But essentially, and I know their lead growth fund team leader who manages their policy for them. They have a different way of doing specific charging. They do it already at a more aggregated level for some of their charges, which that's what their governors have accepted, and there is some inherent risk with that, with challenges and objections through the LTP process that do stem from that. But they lead a more high-level program, and then they have a lot more development agreements that they run through. And that's where their governance is more they have a monthly meeting on development agreements, because they sign up to 30 a year. So they've got a team of around 6 that do that, and they do a sort of a truck and trailer approach with when a developer comes online, let's sort out a commercial term agreement that they can feed into. So it's quite a lot more reactive in that space, and they're more geared up in that space to deal with those specific requirements. And that's where the governance and risk profile, their governance team have said, well, given how many we sign up to, it's that delegation, it's still that committee that gets signed up to. Yeah.
Thanks, Marcus.
So I think that's outlining the next steps. So yeah, the capital delivery program will be updated, and that will be based on both the assumptions and what we're seeing on the ground. You did see a sort of a tidbit to that in yesterday's presentation with Matt, and getting the annual plan adjustments sorted. But then in those workshops that we had, we also looked at the wider outer years and how we can best smooth that to demonstrate how we can pull and manipulate things. There will need to be some additional areas investigated, so some other growth cells that have come online since then. So we'll definitely review those, and those will come through as funding proposals. So a good example of that is the C10 uplift, that industrial hub coming online. There is associated works that are at a council level that we'll need to investigate and see how we best utilise that as a funding proposal. We'll update the charges, whatever gets confirmed, and feed those back through to you, along with the policy provisions of the light touches that we're recommending, and then it will be consulted alongside the wider LTP. I believe in that late 2026 to August, there is a workshop on that, and it's feeding into that DC charge table if there is anything around development levies in that time period as well. And yeah, that's essentially the timeline.
Final question from Roger.
Oh, thank you. And it is one more about the post-35 growth cells that we've got. My perception is that some of them are large lot residential. However, the recent high density provisions, I thought, precluded us from having large lot residential. Is that the case? It's not. No. So we still can have, because there's an infrastructure requirement there.
Yep. That's right. Yeah. So it only relates to residentially earmarked. So if it's post 2035 large lot residential, it still remains that same underlying base assumption. But if it's underlying residential, that's where the density changes. But yeah, and you are right, there are things to consider around the whole program as it relates to when do we expect and how do we expect to fund the post 2035, because we're in a 2037 LTP. That's 2 years of that time period where the growth program needs to be investigated in those later years to ensure that we are forecasting what they will bring on and what they will burden the wider community with. And so what are our overall 30-year programs looking like in our infrastructure strategy that we should start to consider in the model with those?
Yeah.
So I think that's me. Oh, sorry, getting ahead of myself. Yeah.
Thank you. No, it's a big and complex topic, that one, and you explained it really, really well. So thank you so much. And thanks, Matt, for your input too, and Steph as well. Right, we are slightly ahead, but our lunch is not arriving till 12:15. So what I think I'd like to do is bring George in for 15 minutes, and then we'll pause here, have our break, and come back to finish funding and grants. Hi, George. Thanks, George.
Thank you. All right, so the next sort of section of discussion is around funds and grants and the review of those as part of the LTP process, and we'll see how far we get through this. What I'll do is I will talk through the presentation before taking any questions, if that's okay. Cool. All right, so just in terms of what we're talking about here. So we're talking about investments made by council to support organisations, projects and activities with the aim of contributing to community wellbeing and outcomes. And there are a number of funds and grants that council currently supports. Casting our mind back, I think as part of the development of the 25-34 LTP, quite a comprehensive review was undertaken by elected members at this point in time. And I guess what the point of this today is to get guidance from you about the scope of the review or the approach that you'd like to take this time, okay? So what we've done is we've provided you with the envelope of funding. We haven't provided you intentionally with the level down in terms of itemising because we want to get an approach first. Recognise the fact too that as part of the level of service discussion yesterday, you know, this is part of a broader suite. And as Matt went through yesterday, the funds and grants, you know, is probably a lower significant portion of funds, and it was down the bottom of that bar chart that he showed. So you can see the different buckets there. We're roughly dealing with an envelope of about 1.5 million. Now, staff have done quite a bit of work over recent weeks to make sure that we have an accurate picture. And with all transparency, we probably do need to do a little bit more work. There might be some snippets sitting within operating budgets that we haven't quite managed to identify yet. But that's roughly the envelope at the moment that we're working to. So in terms of the review itself. So there are different ways currently that these funds and grants are distributed. So there are some that are contestable. There are some that are rolled over year to year. And it would be probably fair to say that at the moment, there probably isn't a robust framework or criteria with which these funds and grants are distributed. They cover multiple types of services, including community safety, heritage, iwi support services, etc. So they're not really sort of formed by type or even geography at the moment either in terms of placemaking. And the other probably point to note is there's limited monitoring and accountability in regards to the funds and grants that are issued. Some are reported back to us, but that would be probably the exception rather than the rule. So what we're doing is we want to seek guidance from elected members in regards to what review you'd like us to take for the LTP, and in terms of the scope, and also about potentially improving the consistency or the governance within which these funds and grants are allocated. So there are a number of options, and we're not looking for guidance on the options today. We're just highlighting the fact that there are different ways that this could be looked at. So in terms of the scope of the review, we could just do a very light touch and roll them over, but then look over the next 12 months to actually look to potentially put more of a framework and or policy in place for the distribution of them, which would then kick in potentially for the 27-28 annual plan. Or we could do a further deep dive now, noting in the context of the significance of the investment, it is smaller compared to the other levers that you're trying to look at. So I'm probably just going to leave it there for the moment and take questions, but the essence of this is seeking guidance around approach for the LTP, and also approach potentially in terms of if you'd like to investigate looking at ways of doing this differently.
Thanks, George. And I'd be keen to hear from people. I've got Roger first. Angie, I'm keen to hear from you on this as well from a community board perspective, but we'll start with Roger. Claire.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is a very relevant discussion for us to have. And preference is that we do something and put it in place for the LTP rather than leave it and do a full deep dive, as you suggest, ready for the following years. One of the things I'd like to see, because maybe one of the decisions is how has that grant performed over, say, a period of 5 years? Like, what's been the progression of the grant? Has there been any cost of living increase or whatever? But I think the history of the grant provision in, say, the last 5 years would be a matter that would be of interest, well, certainly to me, as to what our policy would be on the individual grants. So I'd certainly like to see some more information on what grants are involved in this consideration, plus their history over time, if that's possible.
Yeah, and noted, Councillor Gordon, and I guess that's the question that we're asking in terms of resource requirements to do that for this LTP. If we were to sort of put more, a lot more analysis and robustness around it, it's likely that it would take till the next annual plan for us to kick that in, but provide you with further discussion points over time. So I'm just signalling that to you now.
Thanks, George. Right, Claire.
Yeah, thanks. Because I think what you've said is the quantum that we're talking about, it's not a particularly large lever. Yeah. However, I do think they are really important. Yeah, the grants and the funding that we do provide, especially to those community organisations. So I would be really keen to have that more fulsome review about a principle-based funding policy, and then getting assessment and following up on that accountability, or even more like them coming and say what great things they've done. Yeah, because they've been funded to do it. Yeah, because we don't always hear from them. Yeah, I guess. I do feel it's important to us to recognise that the purpose of local government, has been changed by legislation to say that back to the basics. So I feel part of that has to demonstrate that it meets the criteria that that's defined in the legislation now, so that we can demonstrate to our community that these organisations and activities we're funding definitely are firmly within that those boundaries. Yeah.
Thanks, Claire. Dean, and then Shane, and then Dale-Marie.
Thanks very much. I'd be interested to know whether we can do a review of all the grant schemes and find a more efficient way of perhaps putting some of the schemes together with similar policies, and then some bespoke bits depending on what the grants are for a couple of reasons. One, Roger and I sit on one that's been undersubscribed the last twice that I've sat, and the one prior to that, as far as I know, and yet the monies have been made available, but then it may also fall into a scope of something else. So if we had a more overlapping scheme, we might be able to say, this is not needed so much this year, but there is a need for money in another area. Presently, we can't really do anything with it. And I also think from someone who's applied for grants before, especially in the arts area, which I know is only one that we administer, but for smaller so promoters like I was, 2 rounds a year was quite difficult, because I didn't often plan sort of almost a whole year in advance for an event, which is almost what's required if you want to, meet something and then do it within the 6 months that was required, or whatever the time frame was. So we might be able to do more spread out if we had a different system for some of those ones, for the smaller operators, as I say, so that they can, come up, an idea comes up, and within the time frame of the next 3 or 4 months, there actually is a scheme they can apply to, rather than having missed out and then not being able to do the event or whatever it is.
Thanks, Dean. Shane?
Yeah, I'd be very keen to do a reasonably deep dive and looking at all this and how to restructure it. One of the positive interactions the community has with councils is when we give them money so they can hold events or do things. Now, this council over time has probably at least halved the funding for events. I know at least 2 or 3 events that have not occurred because the funding stopped. So I think we need to think about, as a community, events, art, all those things are a measure of our community. And I think we are heading in the wrong direction in terms of where we've gone in the past. So that's one point. Second point I'd like to make is regional organisations. Hamilton, this is just an example of why I feel the urge to look at these numbers. Hamilton and Waikato Tourism, 257,000. Now that's 2 full-time employees. How much economic benefit would we get to Waipa if we employed 2 people to focus entirely on tourism and building tourism in this area compared to what they do? So I just think we need to ask the questions, and we need to think strategically about how we're spending this money. So I do feel a need, and I'm very much like to know what others is. 202, it's still a big number. And I'm sure that once we have that, there'll be other things that councillors will think about. Well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And the other thing is we're trying to do a paper on anchor institutes, that we're an anchor institutes. So this is part of what we do as an anchor institute. So this should feed into what an anchor institute does. And it's that positive interaction with our community. We should think harder about it.
Good point, Shane. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, hey, you talk about the quantum, but look, it's a 10-year plan. So even if a deep dive review can't kick in until year 2, we're still talking $14 million. It's not 1.4 to me or 1.5. Yeah, I agree. I think we need to do a review on this. I mean, my heart tells me I'd love to give more and more. My head tells me all the pointers that we need to save money and be efficient. So whether we save money, let's look at least being more efficient. And out of that may come some savings or otherwise, but these are some of the hard decisions that this table has to make, and we can't always leave with our heart, as difficult as that is.
Thanks, Mike. Ange?
Just so following on from that, in regard to monitoring and accountability, I think that the community boards are pretty good with the discretionary fund. Like, we pretty much say we may not support people in the future if we don't get that accountability back. And I think we are seeing, on balance, more people acknowledging the support. It might not be directly to the community board, but you often see them flying the Waipa District Council banner. But just kind of on the flip side, I suppose, of what me and Mike's just said, I think in doing the review, I'm pretty keen on doing a deep dive too. I think that could be quite good value. But we need to also always keep in mind what our community groups with volunteers, their connections, what they can achieve with a mere $2,000, and how far they can make that go, and the benefit to our communities by providing that leg up. And it is a leg up. Look at the fruit forest. Look at the Rotary doing the Christmas parade. I mean, if we bought that in-house and said, okay, we're going to run an event, I bet you wouldn't be doing it for under $5,000. There's just no way. So I think we need to keep that in mind as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Ange. George, you think that's a strong enough steer that we're quite keen for that fulsome review, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. What that does indicate is the guidance at the moment, and this can be revisited, is you're largely rolling over for the first year of the LTP what is existing. That's not a decision, but that's the guidance that you've given me. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Thank you. All right.
Right.
Now, Joe, are you happy? We can actually get through to the next phase probably of having a discussion around next steps and then stopping the workshop probably before lunch.
Is everyone happy to do that? Carry on. Okay, thanks, George.
I wasn't expecting any pushback. All right. So, hey, I just want to thank everybody for today. I think it's been really useful in terms of getting some guidance on the policies and some pretty clear guidance on the funds and grants. And so in terms of the Treasury management and the remissions one, you've pretty much said you're largely happy with what's been put to you. And obviously there's some more sort of work over time with the development contributions as more information comes to hand. But what we wanted to do now was just touch base on what is actually going to be happening largely over the next sort of six to 8 weeks. And it's a little bit, oh, here's Bridget. No, that's absolutely fine. So what we've done is we've blown up, I guess, the longer one that you've normally seen and try to put a bit more detail in there. Appreciate you might not be able to read it, but it is coming to you right now. So I guess where we're going over September is really starting to really look at some of those large levers that Matt has touched on. So that will include bringing the infrastructure sort of challenges that we face at the moment and getting guidance on those. There'll be a further touch point around the property strategy, which is another lever. We then get into those two policies that we didn't talk about today, which are also sort of ways, I guess, to use as a lever in regards to affordability and what that might mean. As part of that will be the discussion around testing the appetite around targeted rates and user pay settings. They'll then get into the capital program, which again is a big lever in terms of getting guidance from you in terms of quantum and in particular prioritisation, and then also getting down into the fees and charges as well. So there's some quite meaty topics that are going to be coming in September, and you'll see too that the team have also tried to put what EM guidance they're going to be looking for in September. So you get a little bit of a signal now in terms of what kinds of questions you're going to be asked, okay? So I'll probably just leave it at that. September is going to be big lever discussion. It is going to be very much talking about affordability and the tools that you can use to try to help manage that affordability for the community. Are there any questions about any of that? No? All right.
It's actually great having the work, the calendar to actually have a look. It's really good.
All right. Cool.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, George, Matt, Neil. That was a really good workshop. We will finish it there and end with our karakia. Thanks, Steph. Just wait for Zoe to pop it up online. Okay. Puritia te rangimarie. Puritia te aroha, puritia te ngākau pai, puritia ngā wawata, kia kiore e nyaro, haumie huie tākie. Thanks, everybody.